All right, welcome back, everyone. We are at it again today with a very special lecture on a work that is close to my heart. This is René Guénon's The Esoterism of Dante, what I consider to be one of the best commentaries on Dante's work that I have ever read, and I've read a good number of them. Those of you who know me personally know that I love the Divine Comedy. I love the works of Dante. I have spent years teaching them and studying them. And one of the works that really acted for me as sort of a skeleton key to understanding what was going on in the Divine Comedy was this particular work by René Guénon, The Esoterism of Dante. Now, it's almost an essay. It's not really a book. It's quite short. It's about 70 print pages. Those are pretty small print pages as well. It's the type of book you can read superficially very quickly. You could read all that René Guénon wrote about Dante probably in a day. And in fact, I've read this book cover to cover 3 times now. However, I will tell you, if you purchase a copy, and I highly recommend getting a copy of it, you will see it's slow going. And on top of that, René Guénon's works are quite interesting, and we're going to talk a little bit about René Guénon and his biography, but his works are quite interesting in that they're metaphysical books. And I would say the Divine Comedy itself is a metaphysical book. And what is meant by this is that understanding what is going on both in the Commedia as well as in Guénon's works as a whole, not just the Esoterism of Dante, but really everything that he wrote, it requires a certain wisdom and sapience that goes beyond intellectual knowledge. Meaning, someone who knows a lot of things, someone who has a high intellect, you could say, completely could misunderstand or misinterpret what Guénon is saying or what Dante is saying. It actually requires a higher degree of what we might call Sophia, spiritual wisdom and discerning, and an openness of heart to be able to understand what's going on, which sounds quite mystical. And yet, I think there's a certain element of truth to this. So those of you who know, René Guénon, actually, let's transition here. René Guénon, we got a picture of him over here in his normal Sufi attire. René Guénon was born in France to a devout Roman Catholic family. From a young age, he was very, very, very interested in religion. He goes to university and he becomes interested in occult and theosophy, and he gets involved in many occult movements and finds them to be really unfulfilling and in many ways contrary to what he was interested in, contrary to the type of project that he was going to initiate in being what many consider to be the spiritual founder of a movement known as Traditionalism, sometimes called Perennialism. Now, René Guénon eventually is going to abandon Roman Catholicism. He will convert to Islam while he's still in his 20s, and later become involved in the Sufi mystical aspects of Islam, eventually moving to Egypt and joining a tariqa or Sufi order, and from the rest of his life there, practicing as a devout Muslim and writing books in French to a European audience, but about what he considers to be the perennial tradition, or you could say the tradition of the ages, the esoteric tradition that Guénon sees as being common to all religions. And we're going to talk a lot more about that a little bit later on. This is just to say he's considered the founder of this 20th century into the 21st century movement of traditionalism. And one of the big disciples of Guénon spiritually is a man by the name of Seyyed Hossein Nasr. Highly recommend taking a look at him. He's a professor, I believe, at George Washington University. A very, very interesting guy. I've read a number of his books. His books really quite interesting. He's also wrote a commentary on the Quran. We could say it's a translation of the Quran as well as a commentary called the Study Quran. Very, very good. It's dense. I believe it's almost 2,000 pages long. It's very, very, very dense, but high quality stuff. And Seyyed Hossein Nasr is a self-proclaimed traditionalist. And one of the things that he says in a video that you can find on YouTube called On the Reading of Metaphysical Books is he says, look, when you're looking at a metaphysical book, whether it be the Quran, whether it be the Vedas, whether it be the Divine Comedy, the works of René Guénon, he says many of my students will come back to me and say they read the book, but they did not understand what was going on. And he says the reason for this is you have to consider an analogy by way of the image or the symbol of what happens after the fall of man in the garden. It is said in Genesis that when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, that God puts a cherubim with a flaming sword outside of the garden. And metaphorically, what this is symbolic of is that the garden, which in this case is representative not just of paradise, but of, you could say, an unfallen or paradisical state of mind. That's sapience or wisdom or gnosis, true knowledge. that true knowledge is protected by the angel with the flaming sword, meaning those who are not ready to obtain the higher orders of initiation and the higher levels of knowledge are not able to do so. And I will say this is something that I have experienced personally in my own life, having read metaphysical texts at various stages of my life and seeing how they unfold and bring new meanings. I remember for the first time that I read the Bible, I was probably in 8th grade. And even on a basic intellectual level, I could not understand what was going on. Like even on the most literal level of like what is being referred to, why are things arranged this particular way, what is trying to be said, I had no idea what was going on. Later, after having a conversion experience and going back and looking over it again, this would be the third time I had read substantial portions of the Bible, I could then see the allegorical dimensions, how typology was functioning, the 4 levels of interpretation of St. Augustine. I could start to see things out on greater and greater and greater levels of detail. And the reason I could not see these things the first time was not just an intellectual failure, because many people stay at the level of scholastic interpretation, academic interpretation, intellectual interpretation for the entirety of their lives. They never come to see the allegorical components, or if they do come to see them, they see them intellectually, but it never becomes natural for them to understand the symbolic levels of interpretation of a given text. Why is this? Seyyed Hossein Nasr's argument, I don't think Guénon would say something very similar, is this is the angel with the flaming sword. This is the cherubim with the flaming sword, preventing the uninitiated who would not benefit from this knowledge from obtaining the knowledge. It prevents them or impedes them from obtaining the knowledge. So this is just to say, it's a short book, but it is an extraordinarily dense and extraordinarily difficult book. And like many of Guénon's work, it merits rereading, and it only opens itself up, I would say, to those who, through practice, through their way of life, through what Guénon would call the binding of oneself to an exoteric religious tradition, which if you don't know what that means, we'll explain what it means in a little bit, one can come to understand what is being said in these particular texts. And having, as I said, just rereading this text for the 3rd time, I legitimately probably understand maybe 10 to 15% of what René Guénon is referring to. And that's not an academic thing, it's just that much of the text, and he is going to say this, he's going to say it's not a skeleton key to opening Dante. It's actually just the beginning of the proper understanding of what is going on in the Divine Comedy. He's just pointing the way and making allusions. And many of these allusions are quite subtle, and many of these allusions are quite dense in themselves, and he's not going to explain them. He's not trying to give an intellectual interpretation of Dante. He's saying, hey, those who are wise, to those who are ready to hear, this is the path. You should look at this, you should look at this, you should look at this. But he's not going to unfold everything for you. And so I would say I probably understand 10 to 15% of what he is trying to refer to here, which is the most I have ever personally understood. But this is to say I am giving a very limited understanding of what Guénon is doing in this particular text. Now, limited in another way is actually, you're going to see, is quite expansive. This is probably going to be my longest video on the channel yet. I think this lecture is easily going to go over 2 hours. We will see how it ends up. But it'll be the only video of its kind on YouTube. There are not many videos on Guénon's works or lectures on Guénon's work. And as far as I'm aware, there is no significant commentary or interpretation or really even any like sort of scholarly articles or books on this particular work of Guénon, which is the Esoterism of Dante. So without any further ado, we are going to dive into the work. It's going to be dense. So if you have questions, as always, definitely leave comments. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have if anything is unclear. And additionally, if you just want to leave a comment, you know I love reading the comments. Good. So Guénon's opening gesture in this particular book is to talk about Canto 9 of Inferno in these particular lines, which I am going to quote in the Longfellow translation. Now, I just do that because it's public domain. I like the Longfellow translation. In my mind, it's not the best English translation. So if you're looking to get into Dante, to read the Divine Comedy in tandem with René Guénon, especially if it's your first time reading the Divine Comedy, I highly recommend taking a look at Anthony Esselin's translation. I think Anthony Esselin's is the best because, one, he puts it into blank verse, which makes it read very naturally in English. It's I would say the standard English poetic form. The meter is very nice. It has a great flow to it. And it's much more natural than the John Ciardi translation, which preserves the original metrical patterns and rhymes of the Italian. It's in terza rima, but in English it just feels so unnatural. John Ciardi was a phenomenal translator. The fact that he managed to rewrite the whole Divine Comedy in English in terza rima is an extraordinary intellectual feat. But I find Anthony Esselin's translation much more natural. And I would also say Anthony Esselin, as a devout traditionalist Catholic, his commentary is quite good because he's living the type of life that Dante is talking about. He can see it from the inside. He's not just looking at it as, you could say, sort of like a rootless intellectual. He's rooted in the Catholic tradition, and from that reason, it comes from his being. He understands Dante on a level that is much deeper than any academic could understand Dante, because it's the type of life that he's tried to live. And so the commentary is quite good, but I would also say, poetically, he does manage to evoke something in Dante that I don't think other translators have. Now, the Longfellow is very good, especially if you like 19th century English, but again, I think it's missing a certain something. I'm just quoting from it here, and I'll quote from the Longfellow translation throughout, just because I think it's the best translation to use for this video because it's public domain. And so, in any case, the opening chapter of the Esoterism of Dante is going to begin with this particular quote from Longfellow, from the Longfellow translation. O ye who have undistempered intellects, observe the doctrine that conceals itself beneath the veil of the mysterious verses. I'll read that again. O ye who have undistempered intellects, observe the doctrine that conceals itself beneath the veil of the mysterious verses. And of course, the mysterious verses Dante are talking about are the verses of the Divine Comedy itself. He's saying those of you who have intellects which are undistempered. What does distempered mean? It means your intellect is out of tune, meaning you're experiencing a sort of spiritual malady or a lack of spiritual attunement to, you could say, the true vibrational pitch of the universe. You cannot see things the way they actually are because of sin, because you are essentially tied to a sinful way of life. You've lost perception. It's what we call the noetic effect of sin. You can no longer perceive the truth. Because if you think about this, if we look at the Platonic transcendentals, you have truth, goodness, and beauty. And at the highest possible level, at the highest pitch of existence, truth, beauty, and goodness are identical because they're aspects of God. They're aspects of the absolute or the monad, the one, the eternal. And so for this reason, there's really no distinction between these things. And if one is not living a good life, if one is immoral, if one is living a life that is in sin, the understanding is that, well, one loses perception of the truth. One loses perception of beauty. You can no longer see beautiful things as being beautiful. You can no longer see true things as being true. And so if your intellect is distempered, you are not going to be able to pick up on the allegory because you see less of reality than someone who is operating at a higher pitch of existence due to the fact that they are not living a sinful life. They can see things that human beings that are operating at the lower vibrational pitch cannot see. So Dante is addressing those who have the undistempered intellects, those who can see aright as a result of their virtue, as a result of the morality of their life. He says, you will observe this hidden doctrine that is beneath the veil of the verses. And what Guénon is going to use as his opening gesture, saying Dante very clearly, both in his private letters and in the text of the Divine Comedy itself, is suggesting that there are many ways of interpreting the comedy. And that in order to properly understand what's going on, you cannot just stick to the literal or the historical level. You cannot just stick to the surface. You have to look at the symbolical level of each and every line of the Commedia to pull back the veil from the mysterious verses and understand the kernel, the truth, the core of what is going on. So these are the opening lines, and this is what Guénon is going to say about them. With these words, Dante points in a most explicit way to the hidden, and of course, Guénon knows what he's doing here. Hidden means occult. Occult literally does not mean like evil magic or anything pertaining to dark powers or whatever you would want. Occult just means what is hidden. And for Guénon, the esoteric understanding of something is always occult. More on that later. We're going to talk a lot about that dialectic between exoteric, esoteric. But what Guénon is saying is here is effectively we are going to give the occult meaning of Dante. We are going to give the hidden meaning of Dante. So he says, with these words, Dante points in a most explicit way to the hidden, or doctrinal, properly speaking, significance of his work. A work whose external and apparent meaning is only a veil, a significance that must be sought for by those who would fathom it. Elsewhere, the poet goes still further, stating that all writings, not only sacred ones, can be understood and must be explicated principally according to 4 levels of meaning. Okay, so we're going to stop there. He's saying, look, Dante is explicitly indicating to the reader, if you want to understand what's going on, the external and the apparent meaning, like there's a man by the name of Dante, he's 35 years old, he's lost in a woods, he's going to descend into hell. Those things, they're there. They're absolutely there. But the deeper level of meaning requires you to pull back the veil. And what Dante is going to suggest is that all writing operates this way, particularly writing of a spiritual nature. He's going to go back to the 4 levels of meaning of St. Augustine. Now, for St. Augustine, this is in terms of biblical exegesis. So the hermeneutic by which St. Augustine, and also the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, interprets the Bible is through the 4 levels of meaning. And so St. Augustine is going to say you have the literal or historical meaning of the Bible, meaning every event that happens in the Old and the New Testament has some concrete thing in human history that is being referred to. There is a concrete referent, such that Moses was a real person, such that Ezra was a real person, such that Jesus really died on the cross. Like, there is that element. And that's the surface. That's the surface level. But from there, you also have the allegorical, which is to say the metaphorical interpretation. You have the tropological, which is to say the moral interpretation. And then you have the anagogical, which is to say in reference to the 4 last things, the things that exist outside of time: heaven, hell, death, and judgment. So let's give a clear example of this. If we look at Moses crossing the Red Sea, what is happening? Moses is taking the Israelites who are in slavery. They are fleeing Egypt. They go across the Red Sea to the promised land of Canaan. All of the Egyptians are drowned, including Pharaoh, in the Red Sea that pursue Moses. Now, that, what St. Augustine would say in the 4 levels of interpretation is that literally happened. That literally happened. There was a historical event. There was a historical Moses. There was a historical Pharaoh. The Israelites historically were slaves in Egypt. They fled. They did cross the Red Sea. There was a miracle which involved the parting of the Red Sea. They make it to the promised land of Canaan. Literally, Pharaoh dies, or historically, Pharaoh dies in the Red Sea. All of these are real events that happened. But allegorically, what is going on here? Well, St. Augustine will say, in salvation history, this is a type. This is you could say, a typological hermeneutic that can be used to understand what is being referred to with regards to the church, with regards to what is to come in the New Testament. And St. Augustine will say this is a type of baptism. Because what happens in baptism? God's people, Israel, meaning the church in this sense, not the Hebrew people specifically or the Israelites specifically of the flesh, but rather Israel of the church. The church is in slavery to sin. Egypt is representative allegorically of a life of sin, of death. But through the crossing of the Red Sea, through the waters of baptism, sin is drowned, meaning Pharaoh and the Egyptians are drowned, and we make it to the promised land, which is not the earthly Jerusalem that Moses makes it to, but the heavenly Jerusalem, which is in the life to come, after the conflagration and after the renewal of all things. When there is the new heaven and the new earth, there will be the new heavenly Jerusalem that is described in the book of Revelation. St. Augustine is effectively saying that's the allegorical level. But there's also a tropological level of interpretation. The tropological is the moral, which is that we need to flee from sin. We must flee from sin and drown all of our sins in the grace of God, to ask God to drown the sins. Okay, that's the moral level of interpretation. It's telling you how to act. But anagogically, it's also referring to what's going to happen at the end of time, as I just mentioned, that we will be brought to the New Jerusalem. There are these 4 levels of interpretation, and they're working in tandem with each other. And this is an important thing that people have trouble understanding, is that the relationship between allegory and surface, so these 2 things, allegory and surface, is the relationship between soul and body. Does the soul overwhelm the body? You're all soul, the body is completely irrelevant. No. And what happens is if you only believe in the allegorical interpretation of something, so for example, those who say, oh, Genesis is just an allegory. There's no level of historical truth or literal truth to Genesis. Well, that's favoring the soul over the body. If you just say it's only historical, there's no level of allegorical truth to these things, or you believe that if you interpret things allegorically, as many Protestants do, if you interpret things allegorically, you're destroying the historical or the literal. Well, no, that's just the body. That's just scientific materialism without any of the soul. Soul and body have hylomorphic unity. The human being is a composite of soul and body. And likewise, in the interpretation of text, because of this level of organic correspondence, texts have soul and body too. The body of the text is the literal or the historical. So in the case of Dante, it's the fact that we have a character by the name of Dante who's 35 years old, who's lost in a wood, who is going to meet someone named Virgil and descend into hell. Like all of the events of the Divine Comedy are the body. They're the literal or historical interpretation. But the soul of the Divine Comedy are the allegorical levels of interpretation, which Guénon is going to get into. In any case, he continues forward. It is evident, moreover, that these diverse meanings cannot in any way contradict or oppose each other, meaning allegory does not destroy literal interpretation or historical interpretation. Historical interpretation does not destroy allegory. They're in harmony. There is consonance between these two parts. And you're going to notice this happens at every plane of existence because soul and body have, what could you say? They have an anagogical referent on every plane of existence. So, for example, the church in the state. The church cannot just devour the state. And this is going to be, and I'm going to make a video on this later, the metapolitical dimension of the Ghibelline Guelph conflict, which of course Dante was a part of. For Dante, the Ghibelline Guelph conflict is not a conflict between two groups of people. It is a metapolitical conflict that is eternal, that is present in all human societies and all human civilizations. And it's a conflict that will never end. It's fascinating. I can't wait to make the video on that. But the point being, if we go back to this, the church cannot devour the state. That's the soul devouring the body. The soul is essentially negating the existence of the body. But vice versa, the state cannot destroy the church because that's the body destroying the soul. There has to be consonance, symphonia between the two. As the Puritans would say, Moses and Aaron have to kiss. The temporal power and the spiritual power, the two swords have to be united. They have to be in unity with each other. And of course, the allegorical meaning is more important than the literal meaning, just as the soul is more important than the body, just as the church is more important than the state. But one cannot devour the other. There is no dialectical contradiction between the two things. So it's not like, oh, I give more to the body, therefore the soul has less, or I give more to the soul, therefore the body has less. There is symphonia between the two. And there is symphonia in interpretation. Questions on that? Put that down below. Good. It is evident, moreover, that these diverse meanings cannot in any way contradict or oppose each other, but must, on the contrary, complete each other, harmonizing the parts within the whole as constituent elements of a unique synthesis. He continues forward. They're the layers of allegory. There is no doubt whatsoever that the Divine Comedy in its entirety can be interpreted in several ways, for we have in this regard the testimony of the author, as mentioned both in the earlier lines from Canto 9 of the Inferno, as well as in Dante's private letters, who is certainly better qualified than anyone else to inform us of his own intentions. The difficulty begins only when it comes to determining these different meanings, especially at the highest or most profound, and it is here that different points of view naturally arise among commentators. So he's going to say the commentators can agree on three levels of interpretation for the Divine Comedy. They all agree on a literal sense in poetic narrative, and generally agree in recognizing a philosophical, or rather philosophical-theological meaning, as well as a political and social one. So what are the first three layers of interpretation of the Divine Comedy? Every event in the Divine Comedy has a concrete referent in the poetic narrative. So there is a Dante, there is a Virgil, there is a Beatrice, there is a Ciacco, there is a Brunetto Latini, so on and so forth. They're real personages in the narrative who are concrete in the way that body or flesh is concrete. At the higher level of interpretation, every aspect of the Divine Comedy is in reference to some philosophical or theological truth. However, at another level of interpretation, every aspect of the Divine Comedy is also in reference to an actual political state of affairs, both like in the actual concrete period of time in which Dante is alive in the 14th century, as well as universally. Dante is talking about a universal politics that goes beyond just 14th century medieval politics. Now, what is the last layer of interpretation for Guénon? He's going to say, however, counting the literal sense, that only makes three, and Dante advises us to look for a fourth meaning. What can it be? He says as follows. For us, it can only be a strictly initiatic sense, metaphysical in its essence, one to which numerous particulars are related, which, though not all of a purely metaphysical order, are nonetheless esoteric in character, and we're going to get to the definition of that. It is precisely owing to its esoteric character that this profounder level of meaning has escaped most commentators. Again, why? Because it is protected by the cherubim with the flaming sword. Because in order to understand the initiatic meaning, one has to be spiritually prepared to grasp that meaning. If one is not prepared, if one will misinterpret it or cause damage to oneself or others through the acquisition of this knowledge, they are prevented from acquiring the knowledge, which is why Guénon says it's remained hidden for so long, that there have not been open commentaries about what is going on in the Divine Comedy, precisely in order to preserve this knowledge. Because even if it were put forward, most people would misinterpret it. Which, quite frankly, if you go to Goodreads, for example, I hate Goodreads, but if you go to Goodreads and you look at the reviews of the Esoterism of Dante. It's almost all one-star reviews from people saying it reads like a conspiracy theory. This is an awful work of literary interpretation. I have no idea what Guénon is saying. Well, why do they have no idea what Guénon is saying? They have no idea what Guénon is saying, not because Guénon isn't saying something. Actually, Guénon is saying something quite profound. We're only 2 pages in to this document, right? It's that they can't understand what Guénon is saying. That they're not ready to understand what Guénon is saying, and so they can't pick it up. And what Guénon is saying here is most critics of Dante, they are able to pick up on the 3 levels of interpretation, but this 4th metaphysical level of interpretation, which pertains to perennialism, to the universal that is present in all religions, to metaphysics in itself, is inaccessible to most people. He continues forward. Yet if one ignores it, or perhaps fails to recognize it, the other levels of meaning can only be partially understood. For this esoteric or initiatic sense stands to the others as their principle, within which their multiplicity is coordinated and unified. So this is another metaphysical principle. What is higher cannot be explicated by what is lower, and therefore what is lower is explicated by what is higher. So you cannot acquire the highest meaning of the Divine Comedy by understanding the lower meanings. It's not like climbing up a ladder. It's not like, oh, I understand the literal, therefore I can start to grasp the metaphorical, therefore I can start to grasp the political, therefore I can finally move into the initiatic. No. You start with the highest level of interpretation you are capable of accessing, and that gives light to the lower levels. Why? Because what is higher explicates what is lower. What is lower does not generate what is higher. So the lower interpretations do not give rise to the higher interpretation. Which is why, if you look at like a sacred text, say the Quran, historical critical studies for the Quran have been in vogue for the past 70 years, just as there have been historical critical studies of the Bible for about 200 years. Looking at language, looking at philology, trying to break things down. Okay, but the priestly source, is there another source? How many different authors do we have? That's all academic level knowledge. That level of academic knowledge about any sacred text, about the Vedas, about the Quran, about the Bible, is never going to give way to the higher level allegorical, spiritual, tropological knowledge. You're never going to understand the grammar of a word so much that you acquire the moral meaning of the text. The moral meaning of the Quran is obtained by those who live Islamic lives. Because if you live life as a Muslim, you read the Quran from within the Quran. It's as, I believe Carl Jung used to say, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. It's a profound metaphysical principle. And of course, this is what happens to Dante, because Dante is lost in the wood of error. He's lost in sin, and he needs a teacher to get him out of the wood. Well, who is the teacher who gets Dante out of the wood? It's Virgil, the poet of Roman paganism. Because the principle that's being illustrated there, metaphysically, is that the natural precedes the supernatural. For someone to obtain the supernatural knowledge, one must first become perfect in the natural. And so Roman paganism, with its natural virtues of fortitude, prudence, justice, intemperance, is the prerequisite. In order to be a good Catholic, one does not immediately just surge towards the supernatural, faith, hope, and charity. One must begin with the pagan, with the worldly. But in any case, when Dante is ready to be initiated, his teacher appears. And of course, Dante is going to have multiple teachers. He's going to have Beatrice, he's going to have St. Bernard. But when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And so what is Guénon saying here is effectively, in order to understand something, you must be ready to understand what is being there. Because from the lower level of historical critical interpretation, let's say of a text, whether it's Divine Comedy, whether it's the Quran, the Vedas, whatever, you will never ascend to the higher levels. Hopefully this makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, leave a comment down below. Good. Okay, so now what is meant when Guénon talks about the esoteric versus the exoteric? This is a very important, very important idea and theme in his work, and I want to make sure we understand what's going on. So it looks like a dialectic on its surface, that the more esoteric something is, the less exoteric it is. The more exoteric it is, the less esoteric it is. This is false. Guénon believes that this is body and soul. It's the same body and soul division and analogia that we talked about earlier. So just as you have the body and you have the literal reading, you have the soul and you have the allegorical reading, neither one destroys the other. The same is true with the exoteric and the esoteric interpretations of religion for Guénon. The exoteric are the external aspects of religion. So for example, in Islam, this would be praying 5 times a day. The fact that one wears religious headgear when one is praying inside of the temple, the mosque. This would be that one does not drink alcohol. This would be all of the prohibitions, all of like the external aspects of the religion. So for example, exoterically, all of the religions differ. In Christianity, one takes off one's hat, one takes off one's headgear upon entering the temple. In Christianity, one can drink alcohol. In Christianity, right, we can go through, you can eat pork. These are superficial exoteric differences. In Islam, the holy day is Friday. In Christianity, the holy day is Sunday. In Judaism, the holy day is Saturday, right? You could look at all these different things across all the different religious traditions. Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, the different pagan religions of the world, whatever. And on the exoteric level, in terms of concrete external morality, on the basis of revelation, on the basis of the way the religion is practiced, the way one dresses, the norms around marriage, the norms around death, there are differences. There are clear differences between the religions. However, at the deepest level of a religion, you have the esoteric. Initiation, contemplation, metaphysics, mysticism, gnosis, universality, realization, deliverance, union. This is the paradox. The more one unites oneself, one binds the individual personality to the exoteric domain, the more universal one becomes. So the more individualized one becomes, the more universal one comes. It's like I become so, like pick a religion. I become so Hindu that I pop out on the other side and that I actually become universal to all religions. I've united with the absolute. Because this is what Guénon is saying, is that yes, the exoteric is necessary. You cannot discard the exoteric. There are differences in religion. Islam is not the same thing as Hinduism. And on the surface, there seems to be a tremendous conflict. You'll look at modern-day India, a tremendous conflict between Islam and Hinduism. However, the Muslim who has fulfilled all of the exoteric principles of his religion will begin to ascend to the esoteric. Meaning, so he does everything he needs to do. He prays 5 times a day. He abstains from alcohol. He does everything a good Muslim should do. And he starts reading Islamic texts. He studies the Quran. He finds a spiritual teacher. He begins to study the Hadith. He begins to study the different theological texts of the Islamic world. Well, he's moving into the exoteric. He's becoming more and more Muslim. But at a certain point, it shoots outward and one acquires the universal metaphysical knowledge that is present to all religions. Another way of thinking about it is that all religions are different paths up the same mountain. Now for Guénon, this is not the same thing as ecumenism. And I actually had a student mention this to me once, and I thought it was a really interesting idea. He said, it seems like René Guénon is like the right-hand path of ecumenism. And I think that's apt. Because if you look at modern-day ecumenical movements, what do they effectively say? They say the exoteric is irrelevant. They say the exoteric is irrelevant. So they say effectively, oh, it doesn't matter whether one is Muslim, whether one is Hindu, whether one is Christian, whether one is this, that, the other. Whatever religion you belong to, it's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. And what is the universal truth that underlies all religion? It becomes liberalism. It essentially becomes, be a good person, blah, 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 blah. There's no differences between the religions. Whereas Guénon is saying actually the opposite. He's saying there are profound differences between the religions at the level of the exoteric. And this esoteric, you do not obtain. It's not just like, oh, it's atmospheric liberalism. It's be a good person, be nice to other people, so on and so forth. Saying, no. The esoteric, the deepest level truths of a religion, are only obtained and intelligible by someone who has invested themselves in the exoteric. Meaning, to get here, one has to particularize oneself. I mean, think of like triangles going down. One has to narrow themselves such that they become so Muslim or so Christian that they pop out the other side and acquire the perennial wisdom. And what is meant by the perennial wisdom is essentially Platonism, legitimately. Guénon effectively is going to say there is a universal knowledge that was obtained by all human peoples, independently of culture and religion, and that is essentially the deepest and most profound truths of the Platonic and the Neoplatonic tradition. But in order to obtain this knowledge, one must live a truly religious life within the context of an exoteric tradition. And Guénon says, and he's going to mention this later in Dante, or in the Esoterism of Dante, that, well, how do you decide which exoteric tradition to follow? Are they all just the same? And Guénon is going to say the place to always start is in one's own context. The place to start is always in one's own context. So if one is born, for example, if you're born in Russia, and your family is Orthodox. Your job, when you begin to acquire a thirst for higher knowledge and for spiritual things, is to unite yourself to the exoteric as much as possible within your tradition. So it is to become perfect in the external within Orthodoxy, which is to say, to read all the writings of the Church Fathers, to read the Bible, to go to Vespers, to go to liturgy, to commune, to take part of the sacraments, to learn Church Slavonic, to do everything you possibly can to become so Orthodox that you're rewarded with the ability to enter into paradise and bypass the cherubim with the flaming sword and obtain the perennial wisdom. This is what Guénon is saying. And he's saying this is initiatic. This is initiation. That when the seeker is ready, the teacher will appear and the teacher will initiate him into the higher mysteries, which are universal. And what Guénon's argument about the Divine Comedy is, he says the Divine Comedy is an initiatic text. That Dante was an initiate, which is the next argument he's going to get to, and that the purpose of the Divine Comedy is initiation. That by reading the Divine Comedy and understanding the hidden allegory, right, understanding the veil, or what is beneath the veil, rather, of the mysterious verses, one obtains the esoteric. One obtains this universal wisdom that Guénon believed that Dante had access to. That Guénon believed that Dante was an initiate of a particular spiritual order, and that he was perfect within the exoteric, that he was a perfect, flawless Catholic, but that through this sort of perfection of the exoteric, acquired the universal esoteric knowledge. Good. Let's continue forward and see what Guénon has to say. And of course, he's preempting an objection that perhaps some of you in the audience have. He's going to say as follows. Even those who may have glimpsed the esoteric side of Dante's work make many a mistake with respect to its true nature, for they usually lack a real understanding of these things, and their interpretations are affected by prejudices they cannot put aside. Thus it is that Rossetti and Aru, who, if you don't know, Rossetti and Aru, 19th century commentators, who are really the first people to say, hey, there is something occult, there is something hidden or esoteric in Dante's work. Now, Guénon is going to say people have known that for a long time. They're just the first people in the 19th century to put this forward in a published work. And so Rossetti and Aru are going to say, hey, there's lots of hidden things in Dante. And even though Guénon disagrees with some of Rossetti and Aru's interpretations, he's going to say overall they did pick up on some of the hidden meaning in Dante. But he's going to say they are not fully prepared to understand the esoteric of what is going on in Dante. They themselves are not fully initiated into the perennial wisdom, into Sophium, and for this reason they make misinterpretations. What are they? He says it follows. Thus it is that Rossetti and Aru, the first to point out the existence of this esotericism, thought that they could conclude that Dante was guilty of heresy, without realizing that they were introducing considerations applicable to a wholly different domain, so that, though they knew certain facts, there were many others they did not know. And so this is what Guénon is effectively going to say has always been kind of the case between those who are superficially united to the exoteric, superficially, because Guénon is going to say it's not, those who are seriously united to an exoteric tradition do not have this interpretation, and those who are united to the esoteric. He's going to say there's a superficial conflict that happens between them. And what is that conflict? The Pharisaical, those whose religion is sort of an exterior mask, but who have not deeply entered into the exoteric. When they look at the esoteric, they go, this is a contradiction. They see a contradiction, for example, a contradiction between body and soul, a contradiction between the literal and the allegorical. Or they see a contradiction between church and state. They see a contradiction between exoteric and esoteric. And they accuse those who belong to the esoteric of being heretics. And so what Guénon is saying about Rossetti and Aru is that they each make the argument, I think it's Aru makes the argument that Dante is a proto-Protestant, and Rossetti makes the argument that Dante is an Albigensian. Which, if you don't know, the Albigensians were heretics in the 13th century. They believed all sorts of super crazy heterodox things that have nothing to do with Catholicism. And Guénon is going to deny this. He's going to say the idea that Dante is a proto-Protestant is the most ridiculous thing in the world. He's saying actually Dante is probably one of the most traditional Catholics of his own era. And for that reason, the idea that we're going to equate him with Protestantism, which is a totally modern hermeneutic, it's modernism and incipient liberalism in religion. He's going to say to equate Dante with that is ridiculous. And he's going to say, on top of that, Dante has nothing to do with Albigensianism. He's going to say Dante was a perfect, go back here, on the exoteric level, he is a perfect Christian. He is a perfect Roman Catholic. There is nothing that anyone could fault Dante with in terms of the practice and beliefs of his faith. So he's going to say this is ridiculous. But on the level of the esoteric, when you get here, it looks superficially like Dante is saying things that are heretical. But he's going to say this whole dichotomy of exoteric versus esoteric, with the esoteric being heretical and the exoteric being orthodox, is a false dichotomy. And you see this, for example, you want to look at a modern context, in the conflict that we see in the Islamic world between the Salafi, the so-called Salafi, the followers of the Salaf, and the Sufis. Traditionally in the Islamic world, whether you look at the Ottoman Empire, whether you look at the Abbasids, whether you look at what was going on in Al-Andalus, like, what do you want to say, exoteric Sunni Muslims who follow one of the four madhabs of traditional Islam never had a problem with Sufis. At no period of time were people saying, oh, those Sufis are heretics. You have weird examples, like Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah now is very famous because the Saudi Arabian government essentially loves Ibn Taymiyyah. But Ibn Taymiyyah was one of the weird Islamic theologians who actually had a problem with the Sufis. If you look at the golden age of Islam, and most of the classic Islamic theologians, none of them have any problem with the Sufi orders, the tariqah, or what is being professed. And in fact, most of the Sufi mystics, like Ibn Arabi is a clear example. He was like an exoterically perfect Muslim. Like everyone respected him as a Sunni Muslim. They did not say, oh, this Ibn Arabi, he's saying all this weird, mystical, heretical stuff by being a Sufi. We have to treat him as a heretic. This is kufr. No one is saying that. No one is saying that about Ibn Arabi. They're effectively saying, no, these things can coexist. But in the modern world, what happens? The Saudi Arabian government essentially invents a fifth madhab, which is called Salafi. They're supported by the U.S. government in doing so, which is why if you go to Great Britain, if you go to the United States, they're outside of Saudi Arabia, they're the sort of hubs of the Salafi movement. And the Salafis effectively say this whole, what do you want to say? This whole Sufi mysticism is a pure heresy. There is nothing orthodox about this, and these people should be treated like heretics. They're kafirs, right? They're essentially they're non-believers. They're heretics. And what Guénon is effectively saying is no. This is a false dialectic that we have in modernity, because we have to say it's either all body or it's all spirit, and there can't be body and spirit united. And so just as the literal is united with the allegorical, just as the church is united with the state and their symphonia, so too the exoteric and the esoteric have unity. There is no contradiction between these things. So he's going to go on to say as follows. The question for Aru was, is Dante Catholic or Albigensian? For others, it seems to be, is he Christian or pagan? For our part, we do not think it necessary to look at things in this way. For true esotericism is something quite different from the outward aspect of religion. And if it has some relationship with it, this can only be insofar as it finds a symbolic mode of expression in religious forms. Moreover, it matters little whether these forms be of such and such a religion, since what is involved is the essential doctrinal unity hidden between the apparent diversity. Go back to the chart. Apparent diversity. Islam looks different from Hinduism, from Buddhism, from the Chinese tradition, from the pagan traditions. Like, all of these religions look superficially very different in the exoteric. But esoterically, there is doctrinal unity. Continues forward. This is why initiates have always participated without scruple in all forms of worship, following the established customs wherever they happened to be. So effectively, there is no inherent advantage in picking one tradition over the other. The initiate, the one who is capable of receiving the esoteric knowledge, just practices the religion of wherever he happens to be. So you look at your circumstances in life and go, okay, I'm born into a Roman Catholic family, I'm in a Roman Catholic country, I am Roman Catholic. And this is quite interesting because Guénon, in a separate essay, is actually going to talk about why he sees converts. And I find this one quite touching personally, because I had an experience, many of you know, where I became Eastern Orthodox for a period of time and then later reverted back to Catholicism. He says there's sort of mental instability about converts. He says those who try to convert to a religion that is not involved with the world that they find themselves a part of. So for example, if you're in Egypt, which is clearly an Islamic part of the world, and you decide you want to become, I don't know, a Tibetan Buddhist. Many people in the West who decide they want to become for no reason whatsoever, they're interested in meditation and yoga and whatever, they want to become pseudo-Hindus, think like George Harrison. Or they want to become involved in Tibetan Buddhism, or they want to get involved in Japanese Zen Buddhism. Saying there's always an instability there. They're looking for something that they should be finding in the perfection of the exoteric within their own culture. That God puts you inside of a particular culture for a particular reason so that you can follow the exoteric religion of that particular culture. Now, of course, some people say, well, Guénon converted to Islam. He would always be very vague about his reasons for converting to Islam, but he would make it clear. He said, no. My conversion of Islam shows nothing of the instability of the convert. I was not looking for something in the exoteric circumstances of Islam that I did not find within Roman Catholicism. Now, what was then the reason why he became a Muslim? This is very vague, and even Guénon's biographers don't have a clear answer. But Guénon is saying people who look for something exoterically that's not within their own religion. So, for example, you're like, oh, it actually seems like the Orthodox have a more traditional understanding of the scriptures. Or it seems like the Muslims have the proper political order and social order. Saying, no. They're exoterically, these things look very different, but they're all the same thing. They're all the same thing. And if you're sticking at the level of the surface and trying to analyze which surface is better, you are lost. It's not about which surface is better. It's about taking the surface that is available to you in the context in which you were put, and again, personalizing yourself to such a way that, like, I will become so Catholic. If you're born in a Catholic country, you're born in India, I will be so Hindu. You're born in whatever, China, I will become so Confucian or Taoist that I will pop out the other side and obtain the perennial wisdom. In any case, continue forward. So this is an apparent diversity. This is why initiates have always participated without scruple in all forms of worship, following the established customs wherever they happen to be. Dante understood this fundamental unity also, and for this reason, and not by virtue of any superficial syncretism, employed a terminology borrowed indifferently from Christianity and Greco-Roman antiquity, as circumstances required. Because of course we knew that Dante saw himself as an heir to the Greco-Roman world. In fact, in the limbo of the virtuous pagans, Dante puts himself as number 6 of the poets. So he has Homer leading, then you have Virgil, and then Horace, right? And the train of poets continues. Who's the fourth one? I think it's Ovid. But in any case, Dante places himself as number 6. He implies that there's going to be a 7th poet after him, which is quite an interesting idea. But he says, no, I am the heir to the Greco-Roman, I am the heir to the Greco-Roman tradition. And so if I want to use terms from Greco-Roman paganism, like Dante, for example, Christianizes the idea of fortune, I will do so. If I want to say that Minos, King Minos from the Greek mythology, is the one who decides the position of the damned in hell, I will do so. Because for Dante, it's a matter of indifference. They're exoteric symbols that only have weight and worth insofar as their esoteric value. And so many people look at this and they go, oh, this is, particularly Protestants, they look at Dante, it's like, this is so pagan. Virgil is his guide. You have all these pagan figures in hell. For example, the old man of Crete is the one who creates the rivers in hell. The rivers in hell are the same as the classical rivers. They go, what gives? Well, Guénon is saying effectively, for Dante, it's a matter of supreme indifference. We use Christian symbols. You use Greco-Roman symbols. Yes, Dante is a practicing Roman Catholic. Yes, Dante believes Roman Catholicism and everything that a Roman Catholic has to believe in terms of dogma. But he uses the symbols indifferently because Dante recognizes that they're all part of a universal esoteric tradition. Pure metaphysics is neither pagan nor Christian, this is Guénon again, but universal. The ancient mysteries were not paganism. On the contrary, they were superimposed upon it. I'll read that again because it's an important point. The ancient mysteries were not paganism. On the contrary, they were superimposed upon it. Continue forward here. Such being the real character of all initiatic organizations, there are only 2 cases where an accusation of heresy might be made with apparent justification to be leveled at some of them, or at least at some of their members. And in both cases, the charge is connected with disclosing matters, very real ones, that were never meant to be expressed openly, and that must occasion great scandal if they are. In the first case, certain initiates indulge in inopportune disclosures, risking a disturbance in minds as yet unprepared for knowledge of higher truths, and so provoking disorder at the social level. So what Guénon is saying here is like, what causes someone who is involved in the perennial wisdom, who is involved in esoteric metaphysical practice, to be accused of heresy? He says the first is when they unwisely disclose higher level truths to minds that are not prepared to it. Because a mind that is operating at the level of the superficial, who is sort of floating on top of the exoteric, you could think here again of, like the Salafis are a clear example of this. When they hear what the Sufis do, they try to logically look at doctrines and dogmas and go, that's a heresy. And so if a Sufi, not acting wisely, you could say impropitiously discloses what Sufi practice entails or a higher level of wisdom that the person he's disclosing it to does not have the wisdom to understand, he will be accused of heresy. So he says this is the first class of what happens, is when people who are initiated imprudently disclose what is involved in the higher levels to people who cannot understand them. And that causes social disturbance, that causes social unrest. The authors of such disclosures err in encouraging a confusion of the esoteric and the exoteric, a confusion that sufficiently justifies the reproach of heresy. This situation has arisen on a number of occasions in Islam, where the esoteric schools, that is the Sufis, do not, however, normally encounter any hostility at the hand of the religious and judicial authorities representing exoterism. So, like, Islamic judges, for example, never had any problem with Sufis until very recently. This is a modern problem. In the second case, the same accusation is simply taken as a pretext by a political power to destroy adversaries thought all the more formidable for being so difficult to reach by ordinary means. The destruction of the Order of the Temple, the Knights Templar, is the most celebrated instance of this type, and this event has a direct connection with the subject of the present study. So he's going to talk about the Knights Templar in a moment. What he's saying is the second circumstance where we see a conflict between the exoteric and the esoteric is when exoteric forces, which are enmeshed in the political powers of this world, have a political reason to fight against the esoteric orders. And the esoteric orders are hard to reach by normal means. Normal power politics cannot affect them. In many cases because the esoteric orders have tremendous amounts of power, but also because they're often hard to pin down. Who are the figures? Who are the initiates? Who has been initiated? Who has not been initiated? Who are the higher order teachers? In many ways, it's in a realm of shadow. Think about all the shadows and mysteries around the Knights Templar. And so what happens is, in order to make a power play against what they perceive to be as an excess of power by the esoteric orders, superficially exoteric authorities will accuse the esoteric initiates and the esoteric orders of being heretics. And Guénon says this is basically what happened with the Knights Templar, is that the Knights Templar, if you don't know, the rule of the Knights Templar was approved by St. Bernard. St. Bernard was the patron of the Knights Templar, and he had read the rule and he approved of it. And St. Bernard writes many letters to members of the Knights Templar. This is to say, St. Bernard is like, he's a saint of the Catholic Church. He's as exoteric a figure as you can imagine. There's nothing wrong with paying reverence, to asking St. Bernard to pray for you, having medals or depicting images of St. Bernard. He's as exoteric as you can get. There's nothing wrong with St. Bernard. Yet St. Bernard very explicitly in his works approves, 2 thumbs up, for the Knights Templar, which is an esoteric order in which a lot of Catholics, when they look into it, they start to feel kind of weird about the Knights Templar. But what is being said here is, what happens with the Knights Templar is that superficially exoteric Catholic authorities, being jealous of the power that is held by the Templar, in order to dissolve the Templar, say, effectively anyone who's a member of the Knights Templar is a heretic. Now, is that true? No, it's not true. Of course, it can't be true. It literally can't be true. Those things cannot contradict each other. How could St. Bernard approve the rule of the Knights Templar and the Knights Templar also be constitutionally, by their very nature, heretics? This would be an impossibility. But it happens precisely because of the political power that is held by the Templar, and because the powers of this world desire to essentially obtain that power, they accuse those involved in the esoteric orders and in the esoteric realm of being heretics. This is what Guénon is saying. Good. So far, so good. Now, the real question, and this is the beginning of the second chapter. We are only 2 out of 9 chapters in, which, by the way, 9 chapters, that is not an accident, as you're going to see. René Guénon very intentionally makes his work 9 chapters long to talk about the 9 levels of hell, the 9 circles of hell, but of course also the 9 levels of paradise. 9, a very important number for Dante. Terza Rima, you could think about this. The sets of 3s, the sets of 11s, the sets of 9s that we're going to talk about. It's no surprise that René Guénon makes his work 9 chapters long. Quite beautiful, quite fascinating. I could do an entire lecture on like how each of those actually corresponds to things that Dante is talking about. It's extraordinary. That level of parallelism is beyond me, how anyone could come up with that. But this is not the point. Second chapter, René Guénon tries to answer the question, well, okay, we've talked about esoteric versus exoteric. Was Dante an initiate? Was Dante an initiate? And he says as follows. In the Vienna Museum, there are 2 medallions, one representing Dante and the other the painter Peter of Pisa. On the reverse side, both bear the letters FSKLPFT, which Aru interprets as, and forgive my bad Latin, Frater Sacre Kadosh Imperialis Principatis Frater Templarius, For the first three letters, this interpretation is obviously incorrect and does not convey any intelligible meaning. We think it should read Fide Sancte Kadosh, the association of the Fede Santa, of which Dante seems to have been a leader. Now, this is quite an interesting claim, is it not? Was a tertiary order of the Templar filiation, justifying the name Frater Templarius. Its dignitaries bore the title of Kadosh, a Hebrew word meaning holy or consecrated, which has been preserved to our days in the highest grades of Masonry, which also use that title, Kadosh, holy, consecrated. It is not without reason that Dante takes St. Bernard, who established the rule of the Order of the Temple, of the Knights Templar, as his guide for the completion of his own celestial journey. He seems to be pointing out that, given the conditions characteristic of his time, access to the highest possible degree of the spiritual hierarchy was only attainable in this way. Now, is this concrete proof? Is this a smoking gun? No. But Guénon is not interested in rational evidence. Guénon is saying, I speak to he who has ears. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Who said that? What Guénon is saying is, if you are spiritually attuned, you will realize that what I'm saying here has truth. I'm not here to prove it to you in a rationalistic way. Because to those who don't want to believe this, no amount of rationalistic proof is ever going to make them believe this. But he says, to those who are susceptible to believing this, to those who are spiritually prepared to believing this, what I'm about to say will prove to you that Dante was an initiate in Sophia, in the perennial wisdom. And he says, look, we have this medallion, which effectively links Dante to the Knights Templar. Now, on top of that, not only do we have this link between Dante and the Knights Templar, but Dante is going to say, and it really is quite an odd thing, you would think at the end of the Paradiso, his guide to the highest is going to be like St. Thomas Aquinas, would be like a very natural example. Why does he pick St. Bernard? And most of my students, when I would say, oh yeah, St. Bernard is the guide through the highest levels, they go, why? Well, why St. Bernard? Well, the reason is because St. Bernard is associated with the Knights Templar. And what Guénon is suggesting here is that, one, Dante was involved in the Knights Templar, he was an initiate, but also that Dante is saying that for one, allegorically, to obtain the highest levels of wisdom, to obtain the highest levels of spiritual experience, one must unite oneself to an esoteric teacher, to one who is involved in the esoteric order, which within Catholicism, it's kind of like the relationship between Sunni Islam Orthodox, like Sunni Orthodoxy within the four madhabs, and the Sufi Tariqa. Effectively, is you have Roman Catholic Orthodoxy, which of course Dante is perfect in the exoteric. No one can fault Dante for being a heretic in any way. He's perfect in the exoteric. But esoterically, he unites himself to an order that superficially seems to do things that seem heretical. And so what the Knights Templar is in the context of Roman Catholicism is what like a Sufi Tariqa is in the context of Islam. It's an order that deals with the esoteric. And what Dante is saying is, ye reader who wish to ascend to the highest levels of spiritual experience, you must do as I have done. You must take as your guide St. Bernard. You must unite yourself to the order of the Knights Templar. Okay, and in fact, this is quite an interesting proof as well. This is also from Guénon. The word contemplante, which Dante uses later to describe St. Bernard, this is in Canto 32 of the Paradiso, appears to have a double meaning. It's a double entendre, due to its affinity with the very name of the temple, right? Because Dante is saying in the highest levels of spiritual experience, one must live a contemplative life. This is contemplative life against the active life, which again is another analogical representation. The contemplative life, the life of the monk, who spends his days praying, reading the scriptures, fasting, living a life not involved in the world. He does not take a wife, he's not involved in action, he's not involved in politics, he's not involved in war. The contemplative life is clearly higher than the active life, in which one has a family, in which one makes money, in which one gets involved with the powers of this world. But esoterically, why is Dante talking about contemplante? Because contemplation is not just contemplation with St. Bernard, it's contemplante, literally meaning with the temple, with the Templar. In order to ascend to the highest levels, yes, one needs to live a contemplative life, but also one needs to be with the temple. It's a fascinating little pun that Guénon points out here. Now, we're going to stop here with this particular part of it. So I've covered a ton so far. If you have questions, definitely leave those down below. But we're moving on to a separate part of what's going on here. So in this second chapter, after talking about this, and Guénon kind of points it out here, he says, look, this word kadosh, which he's associating with Peter of Pisa and Dante by way of this medallion, he's going to say that title, which is preserved in the Templar, is later preserved in Masonry. And of course, if you look at the history of Freemasonry, Freemasons effectively say their spiritual practice has its roots in the dissolution of the Knights Templar. Now, that, of course, whether or not you believe that depends on what you think of Masonry as an authentic spiritual tradition. Guénon is going to say, look, there are lots of similarities between things that Dante is saying, symbols that Dante uses, and symbols that are used in Masonry. Because for René Guénon, Guénon considers, and people will disagree with this is a controversial take that Guénon has. Guénon is going to say Masonry is an authentic heir to a universal perennial wisdom. And so he's going to point out similarities between the Templar and the Scottish Rite of Masonry. And so he's going to do that for a little bit. But this is going to lead to a discussion of the 7 liberal arts, which is the next thing we're going to dive into here. The importance of sets of 7. More generally in the medieval world, more generally in the Western tradition, but particularly in Dante. Because, of course, Purgatory is a 7-story mountain. And we have lots of sets of 7 throughout the Divine Comedy. And so one of the things that Guénon points out is that within Masonry, the 7 liberal arts have significance. And Dante also talks about the 7 liberal arts. And why are we dealing with these sets of 7, and what is the spiritual importance of the sets of 7 that we see? Well, here's the different links between them. First, you have the septenaries, which we're going to talk about. The sets of 7 in a person's life. So if you don't know, the Bible says the years of the just man are 70 and 80 if he is strong. I'll repeat that again. The years of the just man are 70 and 80 if he is strong. So what that means is if you are a good person, the reasonable life expectancy you can expect to have is 70 years. Do people die before 70? Yes. But he's saying as a general rule, the interpretation is a human being should expect to live to be 70 years old. In exceptional circumstances, to 80. Now, interestingly enough, you can go look into this. Life expectancy in the West has been about 70 years for basically all of human history. A lot of people say, oh, life expectancy in the Middle Ages was like 40 years old. It really wasn't. If you made it past about the age of 6, you lived to be about 70. And life expectancy, in spite of the fact that we have all these improvements in modern medicine, has remained at 70 for most of human history. So I think there's a high degree of truth to this. I don't believe the whole transhumanist Silicon Valley thing that, one day we're going to live to be 130. There's going to be the singularity. Ray Kurzweil takes something like 1,000 different supplements a day so that he can live to be like 130 or 140. That's never going to happen. Individual human beings might have lives that are quite long. 100, 110. That's definitely possible. But by and large, the general tendency when you look across a population is that people die about at the age of 70. Across a population, people die about at the age of 70. And so that number of 70 takes on spiritual significance, both in Christianity and for Dante. So think about Dante at the beginning of the Divine Comedy. He's lost in the Wood of Errors, midway upon life's journey. He is in Middle Earth. Think of Tolkien's Middle Earth, Midyard. Why? He's on Earth. Earth is, as T.S. Eliot says, this brief transit where the dreams cross twilight between birth and dying. Dante is halfway between birth and dying. He's halfway between heaven and hell. He's in Middle Earth. And Dante is, because he's halfway between birth and dying, he's 35 years old. The year 1300, he's born in 1265. Beautiful year to be born. God knew what he was doing in making Dante born in 1265. But in the year 1300, the beginning of the 14th century, Dante is literally 35 years old. He's halfway to 70. And so that number, 70, is going to take on spiritual significance because most of the medievals, and also in the early modern era, it's really only after the 17th century that we lose sense of this. Everyone believed that life proceeded in sets of 7. That essentially I'll just show this now. The first unit of your life, from 0 to 7, was one unit. You are one thing from 0 to 7. So you do not go any sort of, through, what would you say, substantive change. You make the change that a seed to a flower makes. The flower is not different from the seed is not different to the flower. They belong to the same species, genus, whatever you want to call it. But there is a natural evolution from the seed to the flower. And it develops into one thing. Okay, it develops into one thing in particular. That's what Dante is saying here, or not Dante. That's what we're saying here with the septenaries, is that from 0 to 7, you're becoming one thing. And you don't go through a significant change where you become one thing and then another thing and then another thing. There is a natural evolution in a process. And that from 7 to 14, you become another thing. And from 14 to 21, you become another thing. And essentially, you go through a major life change every 7 years. Now, it's gradual. It's not like, oh, I'm 14, now I'm something completely different. Oh, I'm 21. One day I wake up and I'm something completely different. It's that phase between 14 and 21 is one thing. And if you look back in your own life, I can say I've looked back on my own life, I would say this is highly real. This is something that has an enormous amount of explanatory power. And the idea is, like, this first set of 4, you are rising in power. Every year you acquire more power and capability. So that from 0 to 7, you basically have no power and capability. Kind of like how from 63 to 70, you have basically no power and capability. And then from 7 to 14, you're rising in power. 14 to 21, rising power. 21 to 28, rising power. These middle portions here, septenary 5 and septenary 6, from 28 to 42, a man is at the height of his powers. From 28 to 42, man is at the height of his powers. All of the psychic and physical resources of man are at their peak between 28 and 42. And then after 42, really after this midpoint of about 35, life is just a continuous series of declines. Life is just a continuous series of declines where essentially you're still undergoing changes, but then, right, 42 to 49, you lose power. 49 to 56, you lose power. 56 to 63, you lose power. In 63, this 9th septenary is the last septenary in which you experience change. Notice how it happens at a spiritually significant number of 9. From ages 56 to 63 is the last time a person in their life experiences a major change. After 63, which notice, the number itself, 63, sums up to 9. After 63, the person is hardened. The person is never going to go through a major change of personality and circumstance again. They are what they are. They have become what they are. And so a person after 63, they may live to be 90. They may live to be 100, but they are not going to go through a change. They are essentially just in this stagnant period of decline. The last change happens from age 56 to 63. These are the septenaries. And I will say, if you look at your own life, I think there's explanatory power. But also if you look at Dante's life, oh my goodness, there's lots of explanatory power. I made this little chart here. So look, age 9, Dante in 1274. When he's 9 years old, notice the significance of the number 9 for Dante, is the first time he sees Beatrice, which becomes the spark for the Vita Nuova. When he's 18, right? When he's 18, he writes the sonnet that opens the Vita Nuova. Beatrice salutes him. So the second time he sees Beatrice, she waves to him in the street when he's 18. Okay, which also is another significant number. It's a multiple of 9. 1 and 8 sum up to 9. Then 27, which again, 2 and 7 sum up to 9. He composes the prose framework for the Vita Nuova, finishes the Vita Nuova. Okay, about age 30. So notice, age 30, this septenary where Dante ascends to manhood, the middle part, Dante at the height of his powers. He formally enrolls in the Physicians and Apothecaries Guild. He enters public life. Well, who else enters public life at age 30? Jesus. Jesus enters public life and begins his public ministry at 30. At age 33, Jesus is crucified, right? At the height of his powers as a man, right at the midpoint of life. So this is quite interesting, right? And so at 30, Dante enters public life as well. Now, Dante is exiled between age 36, 37, and he begins the period of exile right about here. Now, age 42, the beginning of the 7th septenary. Oh, you think that's significant? 7 multiplied by 7. At age 42, he begins the Inferno. And then at the end of that septenary, at the end of the 7th septenary, where we get 7 multiplied by 7, 49, what happens? He begins working on the Purgatorio. The mid part of the Divine Comedy. And then he publishes the earliest portions of the Commedia. Now, at age 56, he dies in exile in Ravenna. He's buried there. And then we find the final cantos of 56, this one right here, the 9th septenary. The last cantos of the Paradiso are found after his death, actually by his son. They are found hidden inside of his house. There is a legend that is propagated by Boccaccio that those cantos that were everyone thought were unfinished were delivered by Dante after his death. Do some people not believe that? Yes. Do I believe that? Absolutely. I think Dante delivered the last part of the Paradiso after he had died. I think there's no other explanation for it. But in any case, this ends with the 9th septenary. Okay, so you see Dante's life actually does seem to proceed pretty linearly according to this system of evolution called the septenaries. Now, what else comes in sets of 7? We have the 4 natural virtues. So these are the virtues that anyone in Roman Catholicism can obtain, whether or not they're Catholic. Catholics believe all peoples, whether Muslim, whether pagan, whether atheist, can obtain natural prudence, natural courage, natural justice, and natural temperance. Those are the 4 natural virtues. But you also have 3 supernatural virtues, which are only obtained by grace. Those are faith, hope, and charity. You cannot will yourself to faith. You cannot will yourself to hope. You cannot will yourself to charity. Those must be obtained by supernatural means by grace. Okay? But they proceed in a set of 7. Now, similarly, you have the 7 heavenly bodies. The 7 heavenly bodies, which can be seen from the earth. These are the moon, the sun, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, Mars. 7 planets, which of course have profound spiritual significance. Because why? I didn't put this as a set of 7, but why is Rome considered a spiritually significant city? Or look at Tehran. Tehran for the Zoroastrians. Why is Tehran a spiritually significant city? Well, these major cities are built on a set of 7 hills. Well, you go, well, why does anyone care that Rome is built on a set of 7 hills? People care that Rome is built on a set of 7 hills because of the relation to all of these different things. The septenaries, natural, supernatural virtues, the 7 heavenly bodies being the first and foremost among them. There are 7 planets in the night sky that are visible to the naked eye. And those were believed by the Platonists and by the Neoplatonists to be perfect, unchanging, eternal bodies. And that their motions produced a heavenly cosmic music called the music of the spheres, such that when all is silent, your soul can hear the music of the spheres. That's one of the reasons why in spiritual practice people believe that silence has a restorative psychic effect, is because the idea is that the soul picks up on the music of the spheres, which is unintelligible to the human ear, but which is the noise that is made, or the music rather, that is made by the movement of the celestial bodies. And so, of course, if you look at astrology, if you look at Galenic medicine, like if you look at any of the arts and sciences of the classical world and also of the medieval Christian world, the planets play a tremendous role in these. The idea that the planets control destinies, that they control the motion of the fluids in the bodies, like there are numerous ways in which the planets exert a sort of spiritual influence. And so the idea of 7 comes up again and again and again, because if there is some sort of analogy between what happens on Earth and what happens in the sky, that is what you would call a significant detail. So 7 hills around Rome mirrors the 7 heavenly bodies that are visible in the night sky with the naked human eye. Similarly, we have the 4 elements: fire, air, earth, and water, as well as the 3 human composites: body, soul, and spirit. This forms a set of 7. Now we notice, again, we have 4 sort of purely material elements, which correspond to the natural. And then we have these 3 transcendent elements: the human body, the human soul, the human spirit, which correspond to the supernatural virtues over here. Similarly, the 4 seasons: winter, fall, spring, summer. Those correspond to cycles in time, and again, correspond to the natural. But then 3 seasons or states which exist outside of time: heaven, hell, judgment. You also have the 7 sacraments of the church, 7 heavenly virtues, 7 deadly sins, and the 7 liberal arts, which again are divided into a grounded cycle of 4, the quadrivium, and the transcendental trivium. Now, in this case, the trivium is actually what's preceded initially. This is the study of logic, rhetoric, and grammar. So if you wanted to become a free individual, that's why they're called the liberal arts, you had to study for several years the trivium. You had to study your basic grammar, your basic logic, your basic rhetoric. After several years of study in the trivium, you would move on to the quadrivium, which would be the study of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And people go, that's such a weird thing, but it's about proportion at all levels. Geometry, the proportion and logic of shapes; arithmetic, the proportion and logic of numbers; astronomy, the proportion and logic of the heavenly bodies and their motions; and music, the study of proportion and you could say mathematical correspondences and harmonies in sound. All of these things are seen as being related to each other, because in the medieval synthesis, everything was related to everything else. So if you look, for example, at the 4 humors, in Galenic medicine and then also in medieval medicine, the idea was that the human being had these 4 fluids inside of their body that made up their personality, and that when they were changed, caused changes in the personality. What were these? These were choler, or yellow bile; melancholy, or black bile; phlegm, which produces the phlegmatic disposition; and then last but not least, sanguine, or blood, which produces the sanguine disposition. The motion of the heavenly bodies and the changing of the seasons was believed to change the fluids in one's bodies, such that at all levels of existence, any change in the planets or any change in the seasonal atmosphere on Earth causes a corresponding change lower down the chain. It's microcosm, macrocosm of relationships. Because you notice, we have some of these which are earthly, like the elements, body, soul, and spirit, and some of these which are purely supernatural, or some of these which are purely intellectual, like the seven liberal arts. These are important sets of seven for Dante and for the medieval world. And so this is going to come up again when Guénon is mentioning, okay, what is the significance of Dante mentioning these sets of seven? And we're going to get to that in a minute. I need to grab a glass of water, and then we'll be right back at it. All right, we are back. So with no further ado, let us continue forward and take a look at what Guénon is going to say about the seven liberal arts and their relationship, again, to the use that those seven liberal arts come up in the esoteric, you can see within Masonry, also within the Knights Templar, as well as what those seven liberal arts are doing in Dante. Because those of you who have read the Paradiso will recall the first 7 steps of ascent in the 9 rings or the 9 spheres of heaven. Those first 7 steps are all related to what? They're all related to the 7 heavenly bodies. And they're also related to the 7 liberal arts. So each of those steps up the ladder for Dante, they're related to actual sphere, like planetary spheres in each of the different planets. But they're also related to one of the liberal arts. And Guénon is going to make quite an interesting commentary on this. He's going to say, a further commentary is necessary on this subject. For how is it that the correspondences of this kind, where an assimilation to real initiatic degrees is implied, have been attributed to the liberal arts, which were after all taught publicly and officially in the schools? So he's going to make this point. He's like, look, in the medieval world, everyone studied, well, not everyone, but like if you were a male and you wanted to go to academic study and you showed some promise, these were taught openly. Like, for example, at the University of Paris, you would go study the 7 liberal arts, and the study of the 7 liberal arts continued all the way through the early modern period. We know that Shakespeare studied them, for example. And this was just a staple of Western education. And so he's saying, how can there be some sort of occult or esoteric meaning to the 7 liberal arts when they were taught openly? Like, this was a real study of grammar. This was a real study of music. This was a real study of geometry. What he's going to say, it's because, again, it's the relationship between body and soul. You have the literal, the exoteric, the body, but you also have the allegorical, the spiritual, the esoteric. And even within the sets of the liberal arts, yes, you have 7 literal liberal arts. Just as you have 7 literal heavenly bodies that you can see in the night sky. Just as there are 7 hills that surround Rome. But esoterically, on the level of allegory, those have interpretations that go beyond just those particular things. So literally, you need the 7 liberal arts in the classical world and in the medieval Christian world to become a free human being. If you wanted to go on to the higher levels of study, which were medicine, law, and theology, you needed to be a master of the 7 liberal arts. That's where we get the modern idea of the master's degree. How do you call it a master's degree? Traditionally, you were considered a master of the arts if you had mastered the 7 liberal arts, if you knew everything there was to know about grammar, rhetoric, logic, so on and so forth. From there, you could become a doctor of philosophy in the 3 highest studies. Medicine was considered the lowest study because medicine was the logos of the body. Now, if you assemble many human bodies together, you get a society. And so the logos of the society is the study of its laws. And so law was considered a step up from medicine. So medicine was the lowest study, then law is a higher up study. But to study either, to study medicine or to study law, you had to master the 7 liberal arts. But then finally, you have the highest study of all, which is the study of God, the study of the logos of divinity itself, which is, again, it's arranged by order of complexity. In the medieval worldview, physics was the simplest science. Because why? You're studying rocks. It's like the easiest thing to study in the world. They're inanimate bodies. Whereas the study of God would be the most complex thing. And so it's the highest level of study. But the study of human beings, which are also infinitely complex due to the rational soul, if you study human beings in aggregate, well, that's more complicated than studying an individual human being and an individual human body, which is why law is higher than medicine. But in any case, what Guénon is saying is these are open studies. You could go to any university in Paris and study these. These were not hidden or occult knowledge in any way. So he's saying, well, what is Dante suggesting here? We think that they must have been conceived in 2 ways, the one exoteric and the other esoteric. It is possible to superimpose on any profane science, profane here just meaning worldly, another science that is related to the same object, but looks at it from a higher viewpoint, and which is to that profane science what the higher meaning of the scriptures are to their literal meaning. So again, the analogia that we talked about. One could also say that external sciences afford a means of expression for higher truths, since they themselves stand in the relation of a symbol to another order. As Plato said, and I love this, the perceptible is only a reflection of the intelligible. So all things contain an allegorical meaning. All things contain a higher level of meaning. That which is perceptible is a reflection of the intelligible. That which we perceive with the senses is a reflection of the higher world of forms. And so here the perceptible is the seven liberal arts themselves. Yes, you have the study of actual grammar. Yes, you have the study of actual music. But those are just the perceptible, which are reflections of higher order spiritual truths. The phenomenon of nature and the events of history all have a symbolic value, for they express something of the principles upon which they depend, and of which they are the more or less remote consequences. Through a suitable transposition, all science and art can assume a true esoteric value. So this is what Guénon is saying, is that life as a narrative can be read the same way that a poem can be read. So just as we read the Divine Comedy or a sacred text through the lens of soul and body, through allegory and literal, like real historical sciences, like actual historical bodies of study, also have metaphysical value and also have transpositions that make sense in the spiritual plane. So the seven liberal arts, they exist materially, but they also exist in spiritual correspondence. And similarly, the events of human history. And so this will make sense when we make the video on the metapolitical dimension of the Ghibelline-Guelph conflict. But this is to say that the actual events, like things that happen in history, including things that happen in individual human lives, also have consequences that go far beyond the level of the literal. And so he who has ears to hear, let him hear. This is talking about you in your life as well. Good. Okay, so what is the unbroken chain? Because this is the next little metaphor or device that Guénon is going to give us. We shall have ample opportunity later to see what fundamental importance the symbolism of numbers assumes in Dante's work. We already started that with a look at 7. And even if this symbolism is not uniquely Pythagorean and reappears in other doctrines for the simple reason that truth is one, it is no less permissible to think that from Pythagoras to Virgil and from Virgil to Dante, the chain of the tradition was undoubtedly unbroken on Italian soil. I love that. It is no less permissible to think that from Pythagoras to Virgil and from Virgil to Dante, the chain of the tradition was undoubtedly unbroken on Italian soil. So here he goes into talking about the significance of the number 7, which he's going to dive into later, and which is why I didn't include more quotes here. But he's effectively saying, it's like, yes, the number symbolism that we see in Dante, we also see in Virgil. And the number symbolism that we see in Virgil, we also see in Pythagoras. And he's saying, and this number symbolism that we see in these three figures, we also see in other places in different world traditions. But he's just saying this is because the number symbolism is not part of the exoteric. It's part of the esoteric. It's part of the deeper level layer. And he's also suggesting a chain of spiritual transmission that happens in Italy. He's saying, look, Pythagoras lived in Italy, Virgil lived in Italy, Dante lived in Italy. It's no surprise that Virgil was probably initiated into the Pythagorean mysteries, and then Dante, of course, becomes initiated in a certain sense into the Virgilian mysteries through taking Virgil as a spiritual guide. And so he's saying, look, this is part of the unbroken chain of tradition or transmission from teacher to teacher that happens on the Italian soil. And this is very important for Guénon, because Guénon is effectively going to say the tradition is passed down. The tradition is passed down, and the tradition changes superficially. As there's the great Mendelssohn quote, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. So it's not like Virgil, when he becomes part of the Pythagorean mysteries, wants to resurrect the Pythagorean system. He wants to create something legitimately new, but which maintains what is eternal in the sacred tradition and becomes something new, which is Roman. And what Dante is trying to do is he's trying to update Virgil. He's not trying to rewrite the Aeneid. He's trying to translate the sacred fire of the Aeneid and what he has learned from Virgil to create a new epic for the new Rome. Not the Rome of the flesh and the Roman Empire, but the new Rome, which is the Holy Roman Empire, which is the Roman Catholic Church. And to give emphasis to Romanity in a new context, to translate these things in a new way. But this is to say, the tradition has to be passed on from one individual to another. It cannot be acquired in a merely individualistic way. There must be parentage. Just as one has earthly parents, spiritually too, one must have a parent. And so what Guénon is saying is, where is Dante obtaining these different number symbolisms? Where is Dante obtaining these wisdoms? From the study of Virgil. That Virgil, in a literal sense, was Dante's chain into the initiation of the sacred tradition, which is unbroken on Italian soil. Very interesting thought. let us continue forward now. So why Virgil? The question here is, why Virgil? And of course, if you read the Divine Comedy, and in particular you read the sections where Dante is talking about divination and the diviners, Virgil has to defend himself from the accusation of being a diviner. Because why? Virgil was always associated with Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, mysticism, and the occult. And Guénon is going to talk about this here. One question that seems to have greatly preoccupied most of Dante's commentators is that of the sources to which it is fitting to link his conception of the descent into hell. So where does this idea of a poem about descending into hell come from? This is what this third chapter is going to be about. And this is also one of the points that most clearly highlights the incompetence of those who have studied these questions only in a quite profane manner. This matter can only be understood, in fact, through actual knowledge of the stages of initiation, which we shall now try to explain. If Dante takes Virgil for his guide in the first two parts of his journey, the main reason, doubtless, as everyone recognizes, is his remembrance of the sixth canto of the Aeneid, which we may say is also no simple poetic fiction, but gives incontestable proof of the initiatic knowledge. It is not without reason that the practice of the sortes Virgiliae, the casting of lots, was so widespread in the Middle Ages. And if people have wanted to make a magician of Virgil, this is only a popular and exoteric distortion of a profound truth, of which those who likened his work to Holy Writ, even if they did so for a divinatory usage of only very relative interest, probably had more of a feeling than an understanding that they could clearly express. So this is a really interesting idea. There are two things going on. The first thing is this entire chapter in Guénon's work is trying to explain where is Dante getting the idea of descending into hell for the poem. And of course, we see in epic poetry throughout the world tradition a descent into hell. Most clearly in the Aeneid, which Dante had access to. But of course, if you've read the Odyssey, there's a descent into hell into the Odyssey as well. And that, in fact, is where Virgil is getting it from. And what Guénon is trying to get at here, so yes, Dante is getting this from Virgil, the idea of the descent into hell, to include that into the poem. But he's also trying to say what Dante is grabbing at in Virgil is not like literally like, oh, I'm going to copy that. He's grabbing at something that exists in a sort of noumenal way around Virgil, which is the association with Virgil with the perennial tradition or the primordial tradition. And he says people get at this in a sort of mocking way when they say that Virgil was a wizard. He's saying, no, was Virgil literally a wizard? No, he was not. But in associating Virgil with wizardry, he says there's a certain degree of wisdom there. Now, what were the associations? The first was the fact that Virgil made a prophecy for the birth of Christ that you see in the Eclogues. There is a clear prophecy of Christ being born of a virgin that many of the medieval scholastic commentators would say this is an accurate prophecy, and which caused people to suspect in some way Virgil of having some sort of revelation or magical knowledge. There was also the practice of the sortes Virgilianae, right, which was effectively you open up the Aeneid to a random page, and what happens on the Aeneid, it's kind of like a tarot card reading, is supposed to tell you what you're supposed to do in your own life. And so what Guénon is saying is, no, like Dante is not saying Virgil is a wizard or has any of these sort of things. But those associations around Virgil having a sort of mystical, magical thing about him, what they're really picking up on is Virgil is part of the primordial, go all the way back here, is part of the primordial world tradition relating back to the absolute, that he had the perennial knowledge, the perennial wisdom in the esoteric domain. He started here, he started in paganism, and Virgil became such a good Roman pagan that he popped out on the other side and had the absolute knowledge. Same thing could be said of Homer, that Homer was such a good Greek pagan that he popped out on the other side and had the absolute knowledge. Now Dante is doing the same thing, but from a different point on the circle. Dante is going to become so Roman Catholic that he pops out on the other side of the perennial Sophia and obtains these ideas that are going to show up in other religions as well. Because this is the next thing. He being Guénon, we're going to talk about this guy, Miguel Asín Palacios. If you don't know, Miguel Asín Palacios was a very famous Spanish Roman Catholic priest who knew a ton about Islam. He studied Islam. He was one of the greatest 20th century Islamic scholars in all of Europe. No question about it. The stuff that he wrote, it blows everything that was written by the 19th century Orientalists out of the water. And Miguel Asín Palacios writes a book called Dante and Islam, where effectively he shows all of the things that Dante seems to borrow from Islam. And now Miguel Asín Palacios is effectively going to say, where's Dante getting this from? He's saying Dante probably had secondhand knowledge of Ibn Arabi. Well, where was Dante getting knowledge of Ibn Arabi? Probably from Brunetto Latini. Brunetto Latini spent time in Spain. Dante knew other people who spent time in Spain. He probably obtained things from Ibn Arabi through secondhand sources. Now, what Guénon is going to say is, whether or not Dante was aware of Ibn Arabi as a poet is irrelevant. Guénon is going to say, actually, I don't think he was aware of Ibn Arabi. And the reason why Guénon is going to say this is because if he was aware of Ibn Arabi, he would have put him in the realm of the virtuous pagans with Avicenna and Averroes, right? Because in the limbo of the virtuous pagans, we see, of course, Homer. We see like all the great classical figures, but we don't. We even see Saladin. We see Saladin, the Muslim figure, but we don't see Ibn Arabi. So Guénon is going to say, I really don't believe, I really don't think that Dante had an awareness of Ibn Arabi that way. But then the question is, well, how do we explain all of these similarities between things that we see in Islam and things that we see in Dante? So let's actually give this a read. This is directly from Miguel Hossein Palacios. This is not Guénon speaking. This is quoted in Guénon. So Miguel Hossein Palacios is going to say, let me list out the similarities between what we see in Dante's journey of the three worlds and what we see in the Islamic tradition in the famous night journey of Muhammad. Let's give this a read out loud. In an adaptation of the Islamic legend, a wolf and a lion bar the pilgrim's route. Similarly, the panther, the lion, and the she-wolf force Dante to draw back. Similarity 1. Heaven sends Virgil to Dante and Gabriel to Muhammad. Each satisfies the pilgrim's curiosity during the journey. Hell is heralded in the two legends by identical signs. Violent and confused tumult, blasts of fire. The architecture of Dante's hell is modeled on the Muslim hell. Both consist of an immense funnel formed by a series of levels, with circular steps or paths descending gradually to the extremity of the earth. Each of them harbors classes of sinners whose culpability and affliction are worse the deeper they dwell. Each level is subdivided into several others, allotted to various categories of sinners. Finally, both of these hells lie under the city of Jerusalem. Because, right, of course, the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad begins in Jerusalem, just as Dante does what? Dante begins his journey, lost in the wood of air, above Jerusalem. The entrance to hell for Dante is above Jerusalem, which is going to be significant later. In order to purify himself once out of hell and ascend to paradise, Dante undergoes a triple ablution. Oh, that sounds familiar, right? In the Islamic tradition, a similar triple ablution purifies souls. Before entering heaven, they are plunged successfully into the waters of three rivers that fertilize the gardens of Abraham. The architecture of the celestial spheres across which the ascension takes place is identical in the two legends. The souls of the blessed are ranged in the 9 heavens according to their respective merits and are gathered finally in the Empyrean or last sphere. Just as Beatrice stands aside that St. Bernard may guide Dante during the final stages, so does Gabriel abandon Muhammad near the throne of God, to which he will be attracted by a luminous garland. The final apotheosis of both ascensions is the same. The two travelers, that is Dante and Muhammad, raised to the presence of God, describe him as a center of intense light, surrounded by 9 concentric circles, 9, formed by the compact lines of innumerable angelic spirits who emit luminous rays. One of the circular ranks nearest to the center is that of the cherubim. Each circle encloses the circle immediately below it, and all 9 turn unceasingly around the divine center. The infernal stages, the astronomical heavens, the circles of the mystic rose, the angelic choirs that surround the center of divine light, the 3 circles symbolizing the Trinity of persons, all are borrowed word for word by the Florentine poet from Ibn Arabi. So this is Miguel Hossein Palacios' claim. He's like, look at all these similarities between what we find in the poetry of Ibn Arabi, what we see in the different tellings of the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad, and what we see in Dante. He sees too many similarities. Dante had to have borrowed this from Islam. Well, what Guénon is going to say is no. What he's going to say is the reason there are similarities between the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad, the reason there are similarities between what we see in the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad and in the Divine Comedy and in the Aeneid and in the Odyssey and in other world traditions is because they are accessing a universal human Sophia. Why? Because of they were made perfect in the exoteric, they access the absolute. They access the perennial wisdom, which involves a descent into the underworld. Because the descent into the underworld is not so much a literal descent into a physical realm, even though it is that. It does have the literal, physical, historical body aspect, but it's also allegorical. And what is explained by that allegory, Guénon is going to say, is universal to all traditions. In fact, what he's going to say next is, we're going to talk about Hinduism. He's going to say, look, there are similarities between what Dante is doing in Islam, but also in Hinduism, and also in Roman paganism, and also in Greek paganism. Because why? It's an initiation. We're dealing with an initiation in poetry into the perennial wisdom. Now, I'm going to conclude this as a first part of this lecture I'm going to post the whole thing as one long lecture, but I'm going to stop here just in case my computer decides to wig out. But to conclude for the moment, and in a little bit we will come back and take a look at the second set of slides, again on René Guénon's The Esoterism of Dante. We will be right back. Alright, we are back. So, just to recap on what we had just discussed, what René Guénon is trying to answer here is, how do we see so many parallels between what is in the Aeneid, what is in the Odyssey, what we can find in the Hindu traditions, what we can find in the Islamic traditions, and what we see Dante doing in the Divine Comedy. And René Guénon's answer is, this is not a literal borrowing from one place to the other. Some academics, like Miguel de Palacios, have said Dante must have borrowed from Ibn Arabi. There must be a literal chain of transmission that happened in human history. Others will say Dante borrowed from Jewish rabbis. Dante did know a famous Jewish poet. He must have borrowed this from that source. Or he must have borrowed it from this place. Whereas René Guénon is saying, no. When we're dealing with the esoteric, it's not a question of literal borrowing. It's just that Dante, in having become perfect in the exoteric of his own tradition, which is to say, in having become a perfect Roman Catholic, became subsequently universal and accessed a body of universal wisdom, or Sophia, which we see expressed in all the world traditions. So if there seem to be similarities between what Dante is saying and aspects of Hinduism, if there seem to be similarities between Dante's journey and the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad, it's not because Dante was making a literal borrowing, but it's because he had become in the center of the circle. So if we go all the way back, he had accessed the absolute. He had accessed Sophia by way of becoming perfect in the exoteric and thus acquiring the esoteric. This is Guénon's claim. So he's saying Miguel de Palacios is completely correct in the fact that there are so many similarities between the poetry of Ibn Arabi, the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad, and Dante's Divine Comedy. But he's saying those similarities are not the result of a literal borrowing. Continuing forward, we get the next assertion that Guénon is going to make, which is on this idea of the three worlds. Why does Dante include a journey through the three worlds? Hell, purgatory, and heaven. Now, on a literal exoteric doctrinal level, it's of course because Roman Catholics believe that you have heaven and hell, and those who go to heaven who still have debts that they owe as a result of their worldly sins that have been unpaid at the time of their death will go to pay off those debts in purgatory, will be purified before they can ascend to the beatific vision and ultimately to the new heaven and the new earth that will be created after the conflagration. This is true on the exoteric level. But what René Guénon is going to claim is that there's another esoteric doctrine at play in the doctrine of the three worlds. And so this is what he's going to say here. Let's give this a read. The differentiation of the three worlds, which constitutes the general plan of the Divine Comedy, is common to all traditional doctrines, but it takes diverse forms. And even in India, there are two versions that, neither coinciding nor standing in contradiction, correspond simply to different points of view. Accordingly, to one version, the three worlds are the underworld, the earth, and the heavens, which again in Dante would correspond to Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. According to the other, where the underworld is no longer envisaged, they are earth, the atmosphere, or the intermediary region, and heaven. In the first, one must admit that the intermediary region is considered simply as an extension of the terrestrial world, in much the same way that Dante views purgatory, which can be identified with this region. On the other hand, and taking this assimilation into account, the second division is strictly equivalent to the distinctions made in Catholic doctrine between the church militant, the church suffering, and the church triumphant. So notice, there are analogia present in all of these different levels. Here, again, there can be no question of hell. Finally, a variable number of subdivisions is frequently envisaged for the heavens and the underworld, but in all such cases it is a question of hierarchical apportionment of the levels of existence, which are really of an indefinite multiplicity and can classified differently according to the analogous correspondences that one selects as a basis for symbolic representation. Which is just to say, saying, look, are there different hierarchies of existence? Of course. There are different hierarchies on the celestial plane, or what we would call here the heavenly. There are different hierarchies in the infernal plane, what we would call hell. Why does Dante choose to have purgatory become a 7-story mountain, to have 9 hierarchies in heaven, and 9 hierarchies in hell? Well, what Guénon is going to claim is it's not because these are literal hierarchies. Though in the poem, yes, they have that function. These are literal places that Dante visits. We are supposed to maintain the historical or the physical or the poetic interpretation of what the Commedia is doing. But the real reason Dante is making these subdivisions is not because they're actual numeric subdivisions, but because they correspond to other things that Dante needs them to correspond to. In the case of the heavens, the 7 liberal arts. There are 9 circles in heaven to correspond to the 7 liberal arts and these 2 extra dimensions, which we could get into separately. Same with purgatory. Similarly, we have 9 hierarchies of angels and 9 hierarchies of fallen angels. So Dante is making these subdivisions because they correspond to certain exoteric aspects of the tradition, and they allow him to express higher level spiritual truths. Not, again, because he believes that there are literally 9 subdivisions of hell and 9 subdivisions of heaven. Now, continuing forward, why the journey through the 3 worlds? The heavens are the superior states of the being. The underworld, as the name itself indicates, is the inferior state. When we say superior and inferior, this must be understood in relation to the human or terrestrial state, which is naturally taken as a term of comparison, since it serves necessarily as our starting point. Okay, so what is being said here by Guénon? Yes, heaven and hell, real places that Dante visits in the poem. But they are also explorations of different states of the human being. Because what does Dante say right at the beginning of the Divine Comedy? Midway upon our life's journey. So yes, Dante, the character or the poet, is 35. It's the year 1300. He's midway between birth and dying. He's in Middle Earth. He's in the terrestrial Jerusalem, wandering through the woods, lost. But it's also us. It's also you and I in the beginning of the poem. And so what we're saying here is that we are midway between heaven and earth. We are midway between birth and dying. And this poem, this journey that Dante is going to go through the 3 worlds, you will visit hell, you will visit purgatory, you will visit heaven, is a journey that we also must go through, allegorically. What is meant by this is that we must come to know, should we wish to become spiritually integrated, the lower states of the human being, which are represented by the underworld, and the higher states of the human being, which are or rather, you could say the superhuman states of the human being, that which goes beyond human experience, which are represented by the celestial. And so then what the Divine Comedy becomes is an interior psychological journey through what an integrated human being must do to acquire the highest states of human existence. And what is that? Hell is learning to hate sin. The journey through the inferno is a mirror to the human being. Because I always tell this to my students. You get the sort of public school, really bad interpretation of Dante, which unfortunately is even perpetrated at some universities, which is, why does Dante invent all these crazy punishments in the inferno? Is he just some sort of sadistic medieval man who liked to imagine people suffering? And the answer is no. That's ridiculous. Of course that's not what he's doing. The reason why, for example, let's take Chaco the hog. Why is Chaco punished the way he is? He is face down in a pile of excrement, just absolute filth. He's flattened by an eternal cold rain, and he is unable to look up at the sun. He is unable to contemplate the divine or the celestial. Because what is Dante saying? He's saying, look, in this life, the life that you're actually living now, what is it to be a glutton? What is it to be obsessed with satisfying bodily appetites? Food, drink, alcohol, drugs. It is to be face down in the earth, immersed in the filth of things that distract from the higher contemplation, from spiritual wisdom, from gnosis. You will never be able to contemplate those things so long as you remain focused on the filth. And so what God does in Dante's Divine Comedy is not punish. He's not being sadistic, like, oh, you got to have your fun here on earth, but then in hell you're going to suffer. It's to say, no. The very thing that your heart desired most while on earth will continue to be the state that you experience in the afterlife, such that at death, the human heart is hardened. This true state and the true nature of the human heart is revealed, and that state will be experienced eternally. This is what Dante is saying. So Chaco is experiencing what he experienced in life. In life, he was deceived because why? Death is not the erosion of consciousness or the destruction of consciousness. It's an explosion of consciousness. Okay, this is true in all the traditional doctrines across all religions, is that what happens after someone dies is that they experience an explosion of consciousness. Well, what is going on here? That explosion of consciousness for Chaco is the life that I was living is the life I continue to live now. I was granted the deepest desire of my heart, and I am now existing in the fulfillment of that state. So what is Dante doing? Is he going through hell so he can, he and Virgil can point at all the sinners and laugh and go, haha, that's like you have a funny punishment? No, it's a mirror for both Dante and for the reader, because remember, it's midway upon our life's journey. Dante is talking about the reader, you and I, as much as he is talking about himself. He is showing us the reality of various spiritual states. And we begin by looking at the inferior states. We begin by looking at the different sinners in hell and contemplating them and going, yes, I have been there. I know what it is to experience that. I see that within myself. And the reason why Dante holds up this mirror is to learn to hate the particular states, not the persons, but to hate what the state does to the human being. Which is why when Dante sees the diviners who have their heads twisted around, he weeps. Not because it's such a horrific image to imagine a human with their head backwards, but because what that is representative of allegorically. Literally, yes, a human with their head on backwards, but allegorically it represents such a distortion of the human being and such a hideous and inferior state that it is tragic that there are those who experience what it is to experience this lower state of being. And so what Dante has to do is he has to go, the psychological journey that Dante makes through the Inferno, which is also the psychological journey that he wants the reader to make in the Inferno, is the hatred of the inferior states, is the desire to expel the interior states from oneself. Meaning, when you look at Chaco the Hog, you should not think, haha, he did something stupid and now he's suffering for it. He had his fun here. He got his jollies, now he's suffering. No. It's to go, this is an inferior state that a human being can experience if they are not wise and they do not learn to control the lower states. Whether we start with the animal states, which are the least bad per se, the desire for food, the sexual appetites, so on and so forth. Not controlling anger, not controlling the bodily states is the least bad. For Dante, yes, of course it's bad. You want to control the bodily states. But the worst is not controlling the spiritual states. Hatred, betrayal, greed. It's like serious perversion. These, for Dante, are spiritual maladies. But the goal of the Inferno is to purge oneself of these spiritual maladies by looking at them, recognizing them, and then denying them. I always tell my students, the journey of the Inferno is learning to hate sin, is learning to hate what the lower levels of consciousness experienced by human beings do to the human person. That is the first step to wisdom. After that, once one has exhausted all of the inferior states, has seen them inside of oneself, because you're looking inside of yourself, you're looking at, yes, I have experienced this state. I reject it. I no longer wish to experience this lower state of existence. The next step is to learn to love the good, and that's what purgatory is about. That's what the Purgatorio is about, is learning to love the good. Because why? Once you ascend to the top of the 7-story mountain, you are at Eden. What is at the top of the 7-story mountain in the southern hemisphere? Is Eden. That means you are now effectively a perfectly integrated human being, such that you no longer experience any attraction to the inferior states, and you have learned to develop within the human state all of the possibilities that are existent within the human. Such that now, because you are a naturally integrated human being who loves good and who hates evil, you love the good, you hate the evil. You reject evil actions, you perform good actions. Well, now you have returned to Eden. You have returned to what human beings were like before the fall. And then for Dante, you ascend celestially. You can experience the states which are beyond human beings. The higher states of existence, which are inconceivable within the human state itself. That's why the Paradiso is so abstract. Because Dante is describing states. We have that line in the Gospels. In my Father's house there are many mansions. Well, the many mansions are not literal mansions. The many mansions are psychological states of being. They are planes of existence or different vibrations that are experienced as a result of a wish to embody a particular state. And when one has integrated all of the highest possibilities, loves the good, and has rejected all of the lower possibilities, one becomes able to experience states which are beyond the human. This is what Dante is doing. And so the ascent through the 7 planets and through the 9 celestial spheres that we see in the Paradiso, which is so abstract, is abstract precisely because Dante can only allude to what it is like to experience the superhuman states. But this is what Guénon is getting at, is that it's a psychological allegory as well. The many mansions of Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso are explorations of possibilities which are existent within the human state itself. They are not just literal places. They're talking about steeper spiritual truths. Continuing forward. It is easy to understand that real initiation, meaning the conscious acquisition of superior states, can be described symbolically as an ascension or celestial journey. But one could ask why this ascension must be preceded by a descent to the underworld. So this is the question, right? Why does Dante begin by going downward? Why does the spiritual journey begin by going into hell? There are several reasons for this, but these we cannot fully explain now, as it would require too long a digression. I mean, we're already at 2 hours, right? It would require too long a digression and lead us too far from the special subject of our present study. We will say only that this descent is, on the one hand, like a recapitulation of the states that logically precede the human state, that have determined its particular conditions, and that must also partake in the transformation to be accomplished. On the other hand, the descent allows the manifestation, according to certain modalities, of the possibilities of an inferior order that the being still carries in an undeveloped state, and that must be exhausted before it can attain the realization of higher states. So what are these lower states? They are, to use the Aristotelian terminology, and it's the same terminology that St. Thomas Aquinas is going to use, the mineral, the vegetative, and the animal. The mineral, the vegetative, and the animal. Keep this in mind. This is going to become more apparent when we get to Guénon discussing the relationship between Dante and Hinduism. But the descent into hell, which literally is a journey to the center of the earth, right? Mineral existence at its core, is the exploration of the lower states of the human being, which are the animal state, the vegetative state, and the mineral state. Which again, even if you believe, for example, in like the standard evolutionary doctrine that human beings we're star stuff, right, as Carl Sagan says, we're the product of whatever, this eternal process of matter undifferentiation. I don't really know what it is. But essentially, it's like, look, essentially you have carbon atoms, you have all these different atoms, hydrogen, whatever, and they combine together, they form different chemical compounds. Those chemical compounds eventually create life, and essentially the human being is the result of this, like, whatever, billions of years. I don't know what the exact thing is. I don't really care that much about this particular idea. But though the human being becomes, like, actualized as a result of these inferior states. I mean, millions of years of evolution from bacteria into like slightly more complex forms into eventually the human form. That's the evolutionary idea. Now, what is going on here is the human being within themselves contains a history, you could say, of all the inferior states, of what it was like to be a mineral, of what it was like to be a vegetable, of what it was like to be an animal. Now, do traditional doctrines believe in like the millions of years? No, of course not. But what St. Thomas Aquinas is going to say, and this is also in Aristotle as well, is like, look, effectively, human beings have within themselves actualized all the lower states of being. Being, existence, not being a human in consciousness, but just the lower states of being are present within the human being. So how is this? What is a human being for Aristotle and for St. Thomas Aquinas? It is a hylomorphic being of body and soul, and it is effectively an animal who can reason. To be human is to be a rational animal. Well, what is the difference between human beings and animals? Reason. Okay, well, what is the difference between an animal and a vegetable? Vegetables experience growth, but not motion. Animals can experience growth and motion. They are animated. Look at them etymologically. What is the difference between a mineral and a plant? A mineral cannot experience growth. A plant can experience growth. And the idea for Aristotle is that human beings recapitulate this entire process inside of themselves. So Aristotle will say, look, the male seed and the female egg. The male seed is just a mineral. There is no life present inside of it. It's just mineral existence. But when the egg is fertilized by the seed, we experience vegetable existence. We experience this sort of, the spark of human life that has growth. And then from that initial growth, we eventually get an animal, a being that can experience motion and a being that can experience growth. And then eventually, at the period of ensoulment, it becomes a human being, a being that has a rational soul, which can experience growth and which can experience motion. But that process of the fertilization recapitulates all of the previous states of human existence. It recapitulates all the states of being, because human beings are the highest beings in this particular plane of existence, because they are the only rational beings. And so the idea then is you go from being a mineral to a plant to an animal in the womb, and then eventually become a human. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas actually believed this, and this is one of the controversial things that modern Catholics don't really like to talk about, but that in the Summa Theologica, St. Thomas Aquinas says ensoulment begins at 40 days. And that number 40, of course, has typological significance, symbolic significance. We don't have to get into that. But St. Thomas Aquinas is going to say, in the womb, after fertilization, we cannot talk about there being a human being in actuality until after 40 days. Because 40 days in, ensoulment occurs. Why does St. Thomas Aquinas preserve this? Because St. Thomas Aquinas believes, yes, all of the inferior states are actualized prior to the human being becoming a human being. That the human first experiences the mineral state, then experiences the plant state or the vegetative state, then experiences the animal state, and then finally becomes a human being. A human being who rejects the telos, or the end for which human beings are created, descends to the lower levels and the lower orders and the lower pitches and vibrations of existence. What is meant by this? Consider for a moment. Human beings are meant to be rational. A person who acts irrationally is lowering their humanity. They are not acting in a way that is human. And so the idea is to act irrationally for St. Thomas Aquinas, as for Aristotle, is to err, is to sin. Now, of course, Aristotle doesn't have the concept of sin, but he essentially says a man is not acting virtuously when he acts irrationally. If you are excessively courageous without reason, you're being rash, and that is an evil. That's a lack of virtue. Similarly, if you are being cowardly without reason, that is a lack of virtue. And so, for Aristotle, you hit the just mean. When human beings act rationally, they act fully as human beings, and they are being virtuous. And St. Thomas Aquinas is going to say the exact same thing. But if you act irrationally, effectively, you are saying, I do not wish to be a rational being. And you descend down the hierarchy. You become more like an animal, which just experiences growth and motion. And then eventually, if you continue down the plane of existence, you move more to being like a vegetable, which just experiences growth. And even at the lowest level, you become like a mineral. You experience the being or the pitch of existence that immaterial objects experience. Which, of course, if you think about what is sought by those who seek immanence, who seek to exist in a particular state of pleasure, hedonism, whatever, for a moment, it is a lower pitch of existence. They are not seeking transcendence. They're not seeking to go outside of the material plane. They're seeking to immerse themselves in the material plane such that they become matter. This is all to say, for Dante, the descent through the inferior states in hell, yes, it is a literal descent into hell, but it is also a descent back into where the human being came from. It is to remember the lower states which we have already experienced in becoming fully human. Fascinating. Very, very beautiful idea. We'll continue forward. We will say only that this descent is on the one hand like a recapitulation of the states that logically precede the human state, that have been determined in its particular conditions, and that must also partake of the transformation to be accomplished. On the other hand, the descent allows the manifestation, according to certain modalities, of the possibilities of an inferior order that the being still carries in an undeveloped state, and that must be exhausted before it can attain the realization of higher states. So one must attain mastery over the lower states to ascend to the higher states. In order to become a fully integrated human being, one must integrate into oneself the animal, the vegetable, and the mineral, and not have the base appetites, the vegetable appetites, animal appetites, the desire to become like a mineral, to lose consciousness, so on and so forth. One must not allow those appetites to dominate. It must be emphasized, moreover, that there can be no question of the being actually returning to those states through which it has already passed. It can only explore these states indirectly by becoming aware of the traces they have left in the most obscure regions of the human state itself. And this is why the underworld is represented symbolically as situated in the interior of the earth. Really quite interesting. Now, continuing forward, what are the higher states? This is what Guénon is going to say. The heavens, on the contrary, are superior states, and not merely their reflection in the human state, whose uppermost extensions constitute only the intermediary region or purgatory, the mountain on whose summit Dante places the terrestrial paradise. The real object of initiation is not merely the restoration of the Edenic state, which is only a stage on a path that must be led much higher, since it is beyond this stage that the celestial journey really begins, but the active conquest of the superhuman states. For as Dante remarks following the gospel, we must seize the kingdom of heaven by violence. And this is one of the essential differences that exist between the initiates and mystics. Okay, so notice, what is happening here is that the reconquest of Eden, to become a fully integrated human being, as in Christianity, Adam is a fully integrated human being, is the beginning, not the end. So, in other words, to have completely controlled the lower appetites and to have exhausted the possibilities of the lower state, and then to fully exhaust the possibilities of the human state by loving the good, by becoming virtuous, by acting correctly, by thinking arightly. That's what's represented by purgatory. So the exhausting of the lower state's inferno. The exhausting of the human state is purgatory, which is why purgatory, of course, is a mountain on earth for Dante. It's a mountain in the southern hemisphere. But that's just the beginning, because once you've exhausted the lower states and exhausted the human states, there still remain the superhuman states. And the superhuman states occur after Eden. When Dante reaches Eden, it's from there that he begins the ascent upward into heaven and through the 9 spheres, through the planets, to experience states that are beyond human. The states that are beyond human. And so the acquisition of Eden, the integration of the human being on a full and complete level, is just the beginning. It's not the end. Interesting idea. And he says that's the difference between initiates and a mystic. One who is initiated is one who is actively going through this quest of rejecting the lower impulses and the desires to experience the lower states, and then fully exhausting the human states. That's the initiate. But the mystic is the one who is, as he says, seeking the kingdom of heaven by violence, who is now seeking to experience states which are beyond the human. That is what the mystic is. But one can only seek those particular states when one has become a fully integrated human being. And that's what the Divine Comedy is the journey for Dante, as well as the journey for us to become fully integrated human beings. In other words, the human state, this is Guénon again, must be brought to its full development by the complete realization of its inherent possibilities, and this plenitude is what must be understood here by the Edenic state. However, far from being the end, this will only be the foundation on which the being will have to stand in order to ascend to the stars. The last word of Inferno, Purgatorio and Paradiso, as many know, is stars. Very, very beautiful, just absolutely beautiful. That is to say, to raise himself to the higher states symbolized by the planetary and stellar spheres in the language of astrology, and by the angelic hierarchies in that of theology. Now, what he's going to say is, this has a profound affinity with Hinduism, and with a doctrine in Hinduism known as the doctrine of the 3 gunas. This is what Guénon is going to say. The 3 phases with which the 3 parts of the Divine Comedy are concerned can also be explained by reference to the Hindu doctrine of the 3 gunas. These are the qualities, or rather the fundamental tendencies, from which all manifested being proceeds. Beings are arrayed hierarchically in the totality of the 3 worlds, that is to say, in all the degrees of universal existence, according to which the tendency predominates in them. The 3 gunas are sattva, conformity to the pure essence of being, which is identical to the light of knowledge and is symbolized by the luminosity of the celestial spheres that represent the higher states. Rajas, impulsion that provokes the expansion of the being in a given state, such as the human, or if one wishes, the unfolding of this being up to a certain level of existences. And then finally, the tamas, obscurity, equated with ignorance, the dark root of the being considered in its lower states. Thus, sattva, which is the upward tendency, refers to the higher and luminous states, or to the heavens, and tamas, which is a downward tendency, refers to the inferior and dark states, or to the underworld. Rajas, which could be represented as an extension in the horizontal sense, refers to the intermediary world, here the world of man, such as our level of existence that we are taking as a term of comparison, which we must regard as consisting of the earth together with purgatory, that is to say, of the whole of the corporeal world of existence which we experience. We see that this corresponds exactly to the first of the 2 ways of looking at the division of the 3 worlds that we mentioned previously. And the passage from one to another of these 3 worlds can be described as resulting from a change in the general direction of the being, or from a change by virtue of its predominance in the guna that determines this direction. So in other words, which guna you allow yourself to be pulled by determines the plane of existence in which you experience. You essentially embody one of the many mansions. My Father's house has many mansions. Well, the mansions are psychological states. They're states of consciousness. And the mansion which one embodies is dependent upon which guna is pulling one at the moment. And if I hate ChatGPT generally, but I did have ChatGPT make this chart. We have the 3 different gunas. So we have tamasic, the rajasic, and the sattvic. Each of these corresponds to one of the 3 realms, or the 3 worlds which Dante experienced. The tamasic world is correspondent to Inferno. What is it? It's the lower, shadowy, chaotic states of the being. What is the concrete work that the initiate does in looking at the tamasic state? It is moral purification. Again, we don't descend to Inferno to laugh at the people we see there and say, oh, isn't it's like Schadenfreude. Isn't it funny that they're being punished? No, it's to see in them reflections of what the state is in itself so that we can learn to hate those states within ourselves. It's moral purification through the contrary virtues. So, for example, if one struggles with gluttony, what's the standard spiritual advice across all traditions? Whether we're talking Orthodoxy, Islam, Hinduism, Confucianism, it's to engage in fasting. It's to engage in temperance. So, at the level of integrating the lower states, the tamasic, the descent into Inferno, what do we have? Moral purification, guarding the imagination, fasting, sobriety, the ascetical exercises. Once one learns to hate sin and hate the lower states, what is the next step? Purgatorio, the acquisition of the higher states in the human plane. What is this? The transmutation of energy. Okay, we take the human energy and we move it towards things that are noble. Art, science, theology, good deeds, so on and so forth. And this is, what is the concrete work? The rule of life, stable routines, obedience trials, breath and attention practices, so on and so forth. This is like the active life of religion and being a good person. And once one has fully integrated themselves, such that they no longer experience a draw downward, tamasically, nor do they experience a desire to experience the world as it is, as this world. They are then moved upward towards the desire of higher superhuman states. And this is represented by paradiso, or by the sattvic tendency. Now, take a look. Here we can see, the three gunas. Okay, so again, we have sattvic, we have rajasic, and we have tamasic. Now, there's a really good explanation of these that I'm going to include from someone who's very well versed in René Guénon, someone who unfortunately passed just a couple of years ago. But he has a phenomenal blog. He never published any books or formal works, which is quite unfortunate. But a great blog called Gornahur, and the man's name is, and I may pronounce it incorrectly, he went by Colagero. And Colagero, interestingly enough, has an article on René Guénon and the three gunas. And he gives a phenomenal explanation as to what is meant by these gunas and how they're used in René Guénon's work. And so I'm going to give this a read, and we're going to use this to understand why Guénon is talking about this here in relation to the three worlds of experience in the Divine Comedy: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Here's what Colagero says. According to René Guénon, theological or exoteric statements, those are like the statements of dogma, can be also expressed in esoteric terms. In The Symbolism of the Cross, he illustrates how the esoteric version deepens our understanding with a precise formulation. For example, in the example he uses from Islam, the categories of the faithful and the infidel cannot depend simply on the nominal affiliation to an exoteric religion. So in other words, when in Islam they're talking about the infidel and the faithful, it's not literally about those who adhere to Islam and those who do not adhere to Islam. It's about something else when perceived from the perspective of the esoteric. What is that? He points out that Islam means submission to God's will. Hence, the faithful or the elect are those who consciously and voluntarily conform to the universal order. The infidels are of two types. The rejected obey the law against their will, that is, they oppose the divine plan and face God's wrath. Those who have gone astray, most people, are ignorant of God's will and are absorbed in the affairs of the world. They're just distracted by worldly things. Now, this corresponds to the three gunas. Guénon relates those tendencies to the three gunas. The elect are sattvic, being pulled upward, ascending to the higher states. They follow the straight path, which is the place of peace, and their conformity to the universal will makes them true collaborators in the divine plan. What happens to the rejected? The rejected are tamasic, following the downward force along the vertical axis, towards the center of the earth, towards the lower states. Because they do so consciously, this path is the infernal way as opposed to the heavenly way. Now, most people, they experience one or the other. Most people do not experience the sattvic pole or the tamasic pole. Most people are here, the ignorant. They're rajasic, interested in working out their potentials horizontally in the human state alone. Now, of course, the initiate has to have an understanding and an integration of all three states. But most people, properly speaking, exist on the rajasic plane of existence. They are not moving downwards towards mineral existence or towards non-existence, nor are they moving upwards towards higher planes of existence, the highest of which, of course, is pure being, absolute being itself. Most people exist purely in the realm of material objects, this particular world, right? They're concerned about their jobs, they're concerned about what they're going to have for dinner, they're living the worldly existence, which again is not fully on the human plane, but exists within the human plane. This is again like sort of lower level worldly concerns. Now, Colagero is going to say as follows. Since everything is subject to the three gunas, it is necessary in esoteric work to learn to recognize their effects. Sattva is the drive to higher states of being and to knowledge. Saints, prophets, and sages provide signposts in this direction. The tamas lead downward from the human state and to the animalistic and even material states, as we mentioned, which is why it's represented. What is the most tamasic? It's inferno. It's at the center of the earth itself, which of course in medieval cosmology, people are always like, oh, they put the earth, the geocentric model is ridiculous, right? They put the earth as the center of not just like the sun revolves around the earth, but literally, like, the entire universe revolves around the Earth. Well, as C.S. Lewis points out in a wonderful work on this particular topic, Discarded Image, he says, look, the reason the Earth is at the center of the medieval cosmological system is because the Earth is the worst place. The Earth experiences change, and so the center of the Earth is the center of all change. It's the worst place in existence. And as you go further away from the center, you experience increasing degrees of perfection. Why? All of the heavenly bodies, like Jupiter, like Saturn, like Mars, like Venus, from the perspective of the night sky, they look like perfect spheres, which of course is the perfect shape in the Neoplatonic and the Platonic schema. They're refulgent, they exhibit light, and they exist in states of unchanging perfection. And the highest possible level in Neoplatonism is the Empyrean. It's the outer fire to which all earthly fire ascends. And that's ultimately where the human being came from. The human being comes from the Empyrean. He's thrown down into the world, a state of change and punishment, and he will eventually leave behind the body and go back to the Empyrean. That's Manichaeism or Gnosticism. But the point being is that if you look at this, it's like, no, the Earth is the worst place because it's constantly changing. There's death. There's, I think I said Duff, not the beer from the Simpsons. There's death. There's suffering. You get hungry. You get thirsty. Things are constantly changing. But out from the Earth, things are in unchanging perfection. And so the tamasic is at the center because it's the center of change. It's the worst. The tamas lead downward from the human state to the animalistic and even material desires. Animal life is dominated by the three lowest chakras: fear, sex, and hunger. These appear as anger, lust, and the desire for power. Hence, anything that excites those feelings, right, the libido dominandi, as St. Augustine will say, can be recognized as tamasic. The majority of people are dominated by rajas, which are recognized by an excessive concern for worldly affairs. Good career, good job, respect by my peers, big house, what am I going to do tomorrow, what am I going to eat tomorrow, so on and so forth. Those are rajasic concerns. Even these are subject to sattva and tamas, but seldom in a fully conscious way. They may experience a call to spirituality, but is usually in a sentimental way, primarily focused on the emotions. It's also very superficial. Others may follow their lower forces, not to consciously oppose God's will, but rather to improve their lot in life. So they exist primarily on the rajasic plane. Now, interestingly enough, Coligero is going to say, well, if you want to become an initiate and ascend and have the sattva pull, the pull upwards towards the higher planes of existence, what must one do to unite oneself, going all the way back to the chart that I had here? What must one do to unite oneself to the absolute? Well, Coligero is going to say, effectively, and this is what Guénon says as well, follow your exoteric teaching. To be specific about the sattva pull, but not very specific, here are some general recommendations. Much of this material has been covered, but more is forthcoming. The first, follow your exoteric teaching. Again, how does one become absolute? By uniting oneself to the particular to such a degree that they become universal. You become so Muslim, if that's what your culture is. Say, whatever, your parents are Egyptian. You become so Muslim that you pop out the other side and you have acquired the esoteric universal knowledge. So you follow the exoteric and become perfect in the exoteric, to learn as much about the exoteric of your particular tradition or teaching as possible. From there, to learn the universal order, the perennial wisdom. To dominate the subhuman states, to not have any desire towards them, to learn to hate them, to abhor them, and to bring them into submission. To purify the human states. So these are the desires for good things, the desire for riches, the desire for power, the desire for knowledge. To have these become purified and to expand oneself out horizontally in the human plane, but also to desire and develop an awareness of the higher states. So these are the function of the gunas. And we see here this doctrine in Hinduism, which is an important part of Hindu practice. The tamasic, the rajasic, the sattvic is the exact equivalent of what Dante is doing in the Divine Comedy. Is that because Dante is borrowing from Hinduism, that this must have been passed down to him from someone who traveled to India? No. It's because this is universal human knowledge that is independent of the mask or the exoteric. Now, continuing forward, it's quite interesting. So Guénon is going to continue explicating on this. There is a Vedic text, so a text of Hinduism, in which the three gunas are presented in precisely this way, the one changing into the other in an ascending order. So this is now cosmology, the origin of the universe according to the Vedas. All was tamas. It, the supreme Brahma decreed a change, and tamas took the complexion, that is to say, the nature of rajas, intermediate between darkness and luminosity. And rajas, having been commanded once more, assumed the nature of sattva. So in the Hindu cosmology, the world begins as undifferentiated chaos. It's nothing but the tamasic. It is pure tama. But the tamas are then organized by the supreme being, Brahma, to do what? Become rajasic. To these lower states crystallize themselves, or their frequency moves upward into the earthly states, the rajasic states. And then the rajasic states are then purified to take on the nature of sattva. This is a recapitulation of the creation, is that we start with chaos, we get the creation of the heavens and the earth, and all the things on the earth, the animals, the plants, so on and so forth, and then the creation of the final thing, which is the human being, who is perfect, the perfect human being at creation, because all creation myths have what? A descent from a golden age. You look at Hesiod. Human beings once had a golden age of paradise, they have lost paradise. In Islam, human beings have lost paradise. The golden age in Hinduism, human beings have gone through the different yugas and have experienced a descent, a loss of power, a loss of virtue. This is universal across all religions, that there was once a golden age. And that golden age is sattva, which is present in the human beings who experience the perfect integration of their human state. But this is just to say, the actual order of creation, whether we're looking at the Christian myth in Genesis or whether we're looking at Hinduism or any of the traditions, we start with tamasic, undifferentiated chaos, we move into the creation of the worldly states, and then we move, by the creation of the human soul, into the superhuman states. Because, of course, the idea is that one human soul is worth the entire created order and universe. Legitimately, and every world tradition believes this, that one human soul contains within itself all of the possibilities inherent within the created order of the universe. When you look up at the night sky, you should feel more noble and more profound and more grand. The whole modern notion, which of course Guénon was very opposed to, you could say, and he's going to talk about this later, is that you look up at the night sky and you feel small. Because it's like, oh, look at the infinity of stars, all these different galaxies and supernovas and, star systems and this, that, the other. Life on Earth is so unimportant. But it's actually the opposite. It's that, no, the one human being is more important than the entire created order of existence. Because that one human being has reason, which allows him to ascend to the higher sattvic states, to the higher planes of being and existence. And so for that reason, creation proceeds in this order. And also, the creation of the human being proceeds in this order, because as we mentioned with Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas is going to say human beings are not ensouled until 40 days after conception. Now again, modern Catholics get really upset about this. In fact, I think there was actually some Catholic who claimed that he was visited by St. Thomas Aquinas, and he said, no, I didn't believe that, and to him in a dream. St. Thomas Aquinas revealed himself to this person in a dream and said, no, I never believed that. Ensoulment happens immediately after conception. Well, very clearly that's not what he wrote, but we'll ignore that for a moment. The point is, what is St. Thomas saying? Ensoulment happens at 40 days because the human being in himself, in the creation of the human being, recapitulates the entire cosmogonic process, starting with undifferentiated tamas and the fact that he's matter, the seed in the egg, moving to the vegetative and animal states, the rajasic states of human earthly existence, and then finally ascending to the sattvic states in the creation of the human soul, which exhausts all of the lower states and which can experience all of them. Essentially the sattvic state of the human soul, the eternal, the unchanging, which can within itself be valued more than all of the created order, okay? Which can expand across all of the different states, superhuman, human, and subhuman, and which also is beyond space and time, which is going to be another important idea for Guénon that he's going to explain shortly. Next thing he says, here is the text outlines the organization of the three worlds, starting from the primordial chaos of possibilities and conforming to the order of generation and the succession of the cycles of universal existence. Moreover, in order to realize all its possibilities, each being must pass, in the way particular suited to its nature, through states that correspond respectively to these different cycles. And this is why initiation, which aims at the total realization of the being. What is the goal of initiation? What is the goal of initiation in an esoteric order? The total integration of the human being. That initiation, again to quote Guénon, must necessarily proceed through these same phases. The initiatic process rigorously reproduces the cosmogonic processes, according to the constitutive analogy of macrocosm and microcosm. Because why? everything on every plane of existence exists in macrocosm and microcosm. We've talked about this with the interpretation of text. Literal, allegorical. Body, soul. State, church. All of these different things exist by way of analogy, because every level of core of existence has a correlative with a different plane of existence. There is an organic correlative across all of the different levels. And so the creation of the human being, in order to create one human being, there must be a microcosmic recapitulation of the creation of the macrocosm, the entire cosmogonic process. This is what Guénon is referring to. Good. Oh my goodness. Now we get the numerology. So after that, Guénon is going to say, okay, we've effectively explained Dante's relationship to the primordial or the perennial tradition and similarities between concepts that we can find in other traditions and concepts that are explained in the Divine Comedy. Now we want to get to certain numerological interpretations of Dante. So most of you know the Divine Comedy is written in terza rima, meaning it's sets of interlocking rhyming tercets. The rhyme pattern is ABA, BCB, CDC, right, so on and so forth, and continues like that. Each line is hendecasyllabic, meaning it has 11 syllables. So effectively, each tercet has a total of 33 syllables. Now, if you look across the Divine Comedy, depending on how you want to count it, you have objectively 33 cantos of Paradiso, 33 cantos of Purgatorio, and kind of sort of 33 cantos of Inferno. It depends on how you count it. Some people say the first canto of the Divine Comedy is just an introduction, and the remaining 33 cantos, because technically Inferno has 34, are the actual Inferno. So you get 3 sets of 33. 3 multiplied by 3, right? You can start to see why that's important. And of course, why is 3 important? Is because in Christianity we get the 3 prayers of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Trinity, the 3 denials of Peter, the 3 Magi, the 3 offices of Christ, priest, prophet, king, the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, the 3 languages on the cross, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, the Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus in Isaiah, holy, 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 the 3 cycles of mysteries in the original rosary before it was so crudely modified by John Paul II, right? The 3 cycles were sorrowful, the joyful, and the glorious. The 3 evangelical counsels, meaning chastity, poverty, and obedience. The 3 nails on the cross, and of course the 3 crosses that are present at the crucifixion. So Dante is playing with this sets of 3s because it's an explicitly Christian poem. It has all of the exoteric aspects of Roman Catholicism because, of course, Dante is a faithful Roman Catholic. There's no reason to doubt this. And so each tercet has 33 lines, and of course we see that 33 repeat itself over and over and over again. Anthony Esolen, actually commenting on this, says something quite interesting, which is, well, then why does Inferno have either 34 or 32 cantos, depending on how you count it? It's because, go back to Aristotle, and also St. Thomas Aquinas. What is sin? It's either an excess or a deficiency. It's an excess or a deficiency. So go back to courage. If you're being too courageous, you're being rash. You're being not courageous enough, you're being a coward. You're being too generous, you're being prodigal. You're not being generous enough, you're being stingy. These are excesses and deficiencies. And so hell is full of excesses and deficiencies. And so depending on how you count it, it either has 32 or 34 cantos. Really quite interesting. In any case, continuing forward, we of course see 7s come up in numerous places throughout the Divine Comedy. Purgatory is a 7-story mountain. Well, what's the significance of 7? 7 days of creation, 7 petitions to our Father, the 7 revelations, or rather the 7s that occur throughout the book of Revelation, the 7 churches, the 7 seals. 7 demons are removed from Mary Magdalene. We have the 7 sacraments of the church, 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, 7 corporal works of mercy, 7 spiritual works of mercy, 7 heavenly virtues, 7 deadly sins. Pentecost happens 7 multiplied by 7 days from Easter. You have the 7 sorrows of Mary. Okay, so we've talked a lot about 7s, the septenaries. 7s are going to come up a lot in Dante. What about 9? Why is 9 important? Well, 9 is important because, of course, it's 3 squared. 3 multiplied by 3 gives you 9. And of course, if you want to look at this, there are technically 99 cantos of the Divine Comedy. You have one introductory one, and then you have 99, a set of 2 9s. Why is that important? 9 hierarchies of angels. A novena is a prayer that occurs for 9 days in Roman Catholicism. There are exactly 9 months from the Annunciation, which happens on March 21st, to Christmas on December 21st. And you have 9 readings of the Easter Vigil, 7 from the Old Testament, 2 from the New Testament. What is 11? Why is 11 important in Dante? We have the hendecasyllabic lines, you have the 11 brothers of Joseph, you have the 11 disciples minus Judas, And then, interestingly, Guénon is also going to say the twin pillars of Masonry. So, the entrance to every Masonic lodge, there are two pillars. Why? The Temple of Solomon had two pillars. And of course, if you know anything about Masonry, they see themselves as heirs to the creation of the temple. The idea is that the spiritual practice that they embody is derived from where? Is derived from the creation of the original temple. And Guénon, again, is going to say, effectively, Dante is an heir to this tradition. Of course, it didn't exist at the time, but Guénon does believe the Masonic idea that they are derived from the fall of the Knights Templar, and so he's going to say there's a lot of overlap in symbolism. We don't have to get into that, but that is one of the claims that Guénon will make. Guénon is also going to say 22 is an important number for Dante as well, because it's two sets of 11. Now, why is 22 important? 22 over 7 gives you pi, which has a relationship to circles, which is, of course, going to become important very soon. We've already talked a little bit about circles. You're going to see there are a lot more circles to come. We also have 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 books of the Old Testament. Now you go, no, they're not. According to St. Jerome, the way that we should classify the books of the Old Testament, according to St. Jerome, who of course developed the Vulgate, the full Latin translation of the Old Testament, he's going to say, no, effectively there are 22 groupings, each one around one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Similarly, St. Augustine, in his City of God, there are 22 books, and we have 22 chapters of Revelation. So these are significances so far. Keep these in your head, and you may want to come back to this because they're going to become important soon. Now, similarly, 33, the number of years of Christ's life. Obviously, every tercet in Dante is going to have 33 syllables. It's 3 sets of 11. Now, Guénon is also going to make the argument that 65 and 515 are really important numbers for Dante as well. Why is 65? Dante is having the events of the Divine Comedy occur in the year 1300. If you look at the Catholic calendar, which Catholics no longer pay attention to, but the Catholic calendar at that time had exactly 65 centuries. It was the year 6500, meaning Roman Catholics at that time believed the world was created 6,500 years ago. 65 centuries ago. And that is going to become really important for reasons we'll explain in a moment. Now, 65 is also important because it internally adds to 11. And I think the gematria for Adonai in Hebrew is also 11 or 65. I actually can't remember that. But if you put 65 in Roman numerals, it gives lux, light. That is going to become important as well. Now, 66, 2 sets of 33, is the numeric value of the name Allah in Arabic. 72, number of books in the Bible, a number of original clauses in the rule of the Knights Templar. 99, the number of divine attributes of Allah, and of course that's 33 multiplied by 3, or if you count the first canto as an introduction, it's the actual number of cantos in the Divine Comedy. Now 515, what's the deal with 515? In Roman numerals, it spells out dux, which in Latin means ruler. That's going to become important. 515 also internally adds to 11. Moreover, to enter Israel, to enter the Promised Land, to enter Jerusalem, Moses prays 515 prayers. And then, of course, finally we have 666, the number of the beast, which is 999 upside down. All of these numbers are going to show symbolic significance in Dante, according to Guénon, that we will explain next. Now, this is what Guénon is going to say about 11 and 22. This is fascinating to me. Under these circumstances, why should 11 not be at least as important as 22? These two numbers can be found associated again in the dimensions assigned to the extremes of the pit of hell, the circumferences of which are 11 and 22 miles respectively. Isn't that an odd coincidence? But 22 is not the only multiple of 11 that occurs in the poem, because one of Guénon's big claims here is that, yes, 3s and 9s are important, but critics have missed on the significance of 11. Each tercet has 33 syllables. Dante is going to be dealing with lots of 11s. There's also 33, the number of cantos into which each of the 3 parts is divided. Only the Inferno has 34, but the first canto is more by way of a general introduction that completes the total number of 100 for the work as a whole. On the other hand, when we know how important rhythm was for Dante, we can reflect that his choice of a line of 11 syllables was not an arbitrary one, any more than the stanza of 3 lines reminiscent of the ternary. Each stanza has 33 syllables, just as the sets of 11 and 22 stanzas we have just mentioned contained 33 and 66 lines respectively, and the various multiples of 11 that we find here all have a particular symbolic value. So he's going to say effectively what Dante scholars have missed on is, yes, they know the significance of 3, of 9, and 33, but we forgot the significance of 11. and in particular the significance of 22, the two sets of 11, 2 over 7, pi. That is going to become very important in just a moment. Now, what's the deal with 515 and 666? This is what Guénon is going to say. Here, the famous numbers 515 and 666 make their appearance, numbers that recur frequently in the trilogy. 66 lines separate Chaco's prophecy from that of Virgil. In 515, Farinata's prophecy from that of Chaco. 66 lines are again interposed between the prophecy of Brunetto Latini and that of Farinata. In 515, between the prophecy of Nicholas III and that of Master Brunetto. So in the Inferno, we get these different prophecies. So there's exactly 666 lines. This is true. You can look at this. It's astounding. Between the prophecy that Chaco gives and the next prophecy that Virgil gives. Now, there are exactly 515 lines between Chaco's prophecy and Farinata's prophecy. So again, the first prophecy we get, Virgil's moving into Chaco's. Then we have Farinata's prophecy and Chaco's. Farinata's being the next one. Then between Farinata's prophecy and Brunetto Latini's prophecy. Brunetto Latini, of course, being the one further down, the one further on in the Inferno. There's 666 lines. And again, between Brunetto Latini's prophecy and Nicholas III's prophecy, the last prophecy we were given in the Inferno, there are 515 lines. Is this an accident? Is this an accident? It cannot be. Now go back to the symbolism. 515 is dux, the ruler. What Guénon is going to claim is that 515 for Dante represents the possibility of a just world ruler. A Holy Roman Emperor, not a literal particular person, but someone who is going to come to set the political and the spiritual order aright. And 666 would be the opposite of 515. Why? 666 represents a worldly power who opposes himself to the dux. So we see these prophecies of various worldly events, which of course occurred. Dante is writing the prophecies after the events have occurred, so he already knows what's going to happen. But these prophecies, we have like an actual rhythm in the poem between evil worldly authority and good worldly authority. It's fascinating because what essentially Guénon is getting at is that Dante, in even the distances, even just the rhythm between the prophecies, has interjected numeric symbolism. To me, it's almost impossible that, like, how could a normal human being write a poem in terza rima to have actually the number of lines between the prophecies be so exact? I mean, it boggles the mind. I hope it breaks your mind too, because to me, it's just something that I find absolutely incomprehensible. Now, what's the deal with 65? We talked about 65 again. 65 in Roman numerals is lux, and it's also the number of centuries before the year 1300. So Dante believes, effectively, when he's midway through life, there were 65 centuries before him. That creation began, that God created the heavens and the earth, exactly 6,500 years before the year 1300. Let's continue. The year 1300 marks for Dante the middle of his life. He was then 35. And it is also for him the midpoint of the times. Here again we will quote what Mr. Benini says. This is a quote, transported by an extraordinary egocentrism. Now Guénon is going to object to this. Transported by an extraordinary egocentrism, Dante set his vision at the middle of the world's duration. The movement of the heavens had lasted 65 centuries before him, and would extend 65 more after him. By a skillful contrivance, he made the exact anniversaries of some of the greatest events in history meet in 3 kinds of astronomical years, and in a 4th kind, the anniversary of the most important event of his own life. Now, Guénon again, he's going to comment on this. What must hold our attention here above all is the calculation of the duration total of the world, or we should say rather of the present cycle, 2 times 65 centuries, namely 130 centuries or 1300 years, of which 13 centuries elapsed since the beginning of the Christian era, form exactly a 10th. Okay, so this is going to be super interesting. We have to get to the next part for this to make sense. The number 65 is remarkable in itself. Through the addition of its figures, it is again reduced to 11. 6 plus 5 is 11. And 11, conversely, is composed of 6 and 5, which are the symbolic numbers of the macrocosm and microcosm, respectively, both of which Dante derives from the principle unity when he says, Italian line that I'm not going to quote from. Finally, it's from the Purgatory. He basically says 6 and 5 are special numbers. Finally, by transposing 65 into Roman numerals, as we have done for 515, we have LXV. So if you move the V into the middle, it's like an anagram. It says lux, or light. Or with the same inversion as before, lux, namely the word lux, as this may have a connection with the Masonic era of the true light. Okay, so 65 is important for Dante. Light. He's saying, I exist 65 centuries after the creation of the world. The year 1300, when I am at midlife, we are at the point of light. And he's going to say the revelation of the Divine Comedy is a light to the world. It is an illumination to the world. He puts himself at the midpoint. Now, what we're going to see is, so we also have, you take that 65 centuries, and you multiply it by 2. And you say, what is, if Dante's at the midpoint of his life, 35, what if he's at the midpoint of a cosmological cycle? Well, that cycle would last 13,000 years. It's been 1,300 years since the death of Christ. So we are 1/10, think about tens in the poem. It's a 100 canto poem. We are 1/10 of a full cosmic cycle away from the death of Christ. It's the year 1300, Christian year. Now, you would say, well, why should we assume that a cosmic cycle is 13,000 years? Why should we assume that a cosmic cycle is 13,000 years long? Dante says there's 65 centuries before him. Okay, so be it. That's what the Catholic Church says in terms of its calendar. That at the year 1300, which is a Jubilee year, which is a very significant year for Roman Catholicism, as for Dante, Dante's at midlife, he's 35, he's halfway between 70, death, and 0, birth. Okay, so be it. Fine, understood. 6,500 years have elapsed since the creation of the world. Fine, so be it. But who is to say there's another 6,500 years? Who's to say that Dante is at the exact midpoint of a cosmological cycle? Well, this is what Guénon is going to comment on, and this is truly mind-boggling. That Dante is actually at the intersection of space and time. That he is outside of Jerusalem in the Jubilee year 1300, with 65 centuries of history before him in the cosmological cycle and 65 centuries ahead of him. Why? This is what Guénon is going to say. But here, what is most interesting, the duration of 13,000 years is none other than the half period of the precession of the equinoxes, and I have a diagram I'll show in a moment, exceeding the exact value by only 40 years, hence less than half a century, and representing therefore an acceptable approximation, especially where this period is expressed in centuries. The total period is in fact 25,920 years. You have to forgive, I'm bad with numbers. So what we're saying here is actually, no, Dante is at the midpoint of a midpoint. The full cycle for the rotation of the equinox, or the precession of the equinoxes, takes place over 26,000 years. So let me show this diagram. This is actually true, right? So you look here, you have the autumnal equinox point and the precessional cycle. Every 26,000 years, it will make a full rotation. Meaning every 13,000 years, it makes a half rotation. The equinox point moves in cycles of 2,600 years. For it to make a full rotation, 2 of these half cycles that are described by Dante have to move, right? Because why? The ancient approximation is that it's 280 years, and they derived this by multiplying 365 by 72 to get a rough approximation of the precessional cycle of the equinoxes. If you divide that by 2, right, half of the cycle, so from this point to this point, not a full rotation, but a semicircle, that's 12,960 years, which Guénon says is only 40 years short. So if you're thinking in centuries, it's a fair approximation. Dante is saying, I'm at the midpoint of the midpoint. Think about that. There are 65 centuries before me. Okay, so that's 1/4 of this precessional cycle of the equinoxes. There will be 65 centuries after me. That's this midpoint, right? So moving from here where Dante is, midway upon life's journey, year 1300, Jubilee year. If another 65 centuries pass, we will be here. And how many years will have elapsed since creation? Well, the universe was created here. It'll be 13,000 years. So Dante's saying, I'm at the midpoint of a midpoint, because this whole cycle is 26,000 years long for this whole precessional cycle of the equinoxes to occur. And this had been known since like ancient Greeks. People had had this approximation. So this is nothing particularly new. If you had studied astronomy, you had studied your liberal arts, you would know these numbers. Now to us, these numbers seem obscure, but that's because we have not had a classical liberal arts education where we studied astronomy the way Dante did. Dante knew what he was doing here. Now, if you continue forward, you're actually going to see this is part of a perennial tradition that exists in other cultures and civilizations. Guénon is going to say the total period is in fact 25,920 years. The great year of the Persians and the Greeks represents half of this period. which again would be what? Well, if you divide this by 2, it's 12,960 years, and was usually estimated at 12,000 years, which is far less exact than the figure Dante gives us, because Dante's going to say it's 65 centuries multiplied by 2. 65 centuries before me, creation of the world, 65 centuries after me. Dante's at the middle of the great cycle, as was estimated by the Greeks and Persians to be at about 13,000 years. The great year was actually regarded by the ancients, meaning just all ancient pagan civilizations, as the elapsed time between two renewals of the world, which must doubtless be interpreted in the history of terrestrial humanity as the interval separating the great cataclysms during which entire continents disappeared, of which the last was the destruction of Atlantis. Actually, this is only a secondary cycle, and I'm going to show the diagram in a moment that explains this. Actually, this is only a secondary cycle, which can be considered part of another more extended cycle. But by virtue of a certain law of correspondence, each of the secondary cycles reproduces on a reduced scale phases comparable to those of the great cycles of which it is a part. Because go to this circle. There are two great cycles. So if you look at this point C here, forgive me, the white is blinding me. If you look at this C here, this would be represented by the creation of the world. Dante is here. This is the year 1300. C is 65 centuries ago, 6,500 years ago. Dante is here, midway upon life's journey. He's literally 35. He's halfway between birth and dying, halfway between 0 and 70. But Dante is saying, I'm also halfway in one of the great years. Well, what is the great year? The great year for the Persians and the Greeks, it represents half this period, 12,960 years. Dante's saying, well, 65 centuries have elapsed since creation. I'm at the midpoint. And when another 65 centuries elapse, we'll be here at point B. Okay, does this make sense so far? This would be a period of about 12,960 years, or about 13,000 years. And so Dante's saying 65 centuries before, 65 centuries after. I am midway in this great year cycle. But you go, okay, but for the full rotation to occur, that's 26,000 years. This whole rotation, if we look at the precessional cycle of the equinox, that only happens every 26,000 years. So what is that? Dante's not really at the midpoint of anything. Continue onward, because you're going to see this is actually true. What can be said of cyclical laws in general will find its application, therefore, at different degrees. Historical cycles, geological cycles, and true cosmic cycles with divisions and subdivisions that again multiply these possibilities of applications. Besides, when one goes beyond the limits of the terrestrial world, it can no longer be a question of measuring the duration of a cycle by a number of years understood literally. Numbers then take on a purely symbolic value and express proportions rather than real durations. So what Guénon is saying here is that Dante does not literally believe that there are an exact 6,500 years left until the cycle ends. He's saying, yes, he does believe, 6,500 years since this point C, but he's not saying there's going to be an exact 6,500 years to get to point B. He's not saying literally I'm at the middle. He's saying in a metaphorical sense, when we look at these numbers as symbols, I am at a midpoint. Now, you're going to go, but it's not a midpoint. The full circle is 26,000 years. Let's continue forward. So, yeah, we see this great year shows up in a lot of different world traditions, relates itself to the zodiac, the different yugas in Hinduism. We are at the intersection of space and time here, and this is what Guénon is going to argue. You say, but it's 26,000 years. Guénon says, let us point out first that if one selects any starting point in time and then counts the length of the cyclical period from there, a point is always reached that is in perfect correspondence to that from which it started. For it is this very correspondence between the elements of successive cycles that ensures their continuity. One can therefore choose the origin so as to position oneself ideally at the midpoint of such a period. This yields two equal periods, the one anterior and the other posterior, in whose totality the full revolutions of the heavens actually takes place, since all things finally find themselves in a position not identical, because if it were identical, that would be to fall into the error of Nietzsche's eternal return, but analogically corresponding to the one that they had in the beginning. So, and then Guénon is going to give the geometry of this, and then we'll go back to the diagram. This can be represented geometrically in the following way. If the cycle in question is the half period of the precession of the equinoxes, and if the entire cycle is represented by the circumference, it will suffice to trace a horizontal diameter to divide this circumference into two halves, each of which will represent a half period whose beginning and end correspond to the two extremities of the diameter. Okay, go back here. You go, this whole thing from point C to point B, that's 13,000 years. Correct. Dante is at the midpoint. He's 65 centuries away from creation. What happens? Look at how a circle functions. You're going up, you're going up, you're going up. You hit the midpoint. And Dante's saying, after this point, you're going down, you're going down, you're going down, you're going down, you're going down. But when you hit this point, you actually start going so far down that what happens? From the vantage point of point B, you're going down such that you're going up. It's like if you're from here, if you're at point A, and you go to point B, it's experienced as downward motion. But from the vantage point of point B, moving to, let's say, this hypothetical point beneath A, D, you're going upwards. You've gone so far downwards that you're actually going upwards. And vice versa. From here, from point D to point C, you're going downwards. But at a certain point, when you hit point C in the circumference of the circle, you have gone so far downwards that, again, you're actually going upwards again. That's what a rotational cycle is. And so Dante is saying, 65 years since point C, 65 centuries, another 65 centuries from point A to point B. But the point B, the end of the great year, is significant because the cycle will continue. Because at that point, what up to that point, right, year 1300, has been experienced as nothing but a decline, from the vantage point of point B, when the next great year cycle of 13,000 years continues, will be experienced as a going upward. So what Dante is suggesting is, okay, if we're looking at this in linear Christian time and we're looking at this eschatologically, the way Christians do, point C is the creation of the world. Point A is the year 1300, the jubilee in which I am at midlife. I'm 35 years old. When we hit point B, 65 centuries from now, not literally, but when we hit that point, this will be the return of Christ, right? From here, from C to A, it was nothing but ascent. And then the world goes into a period of decline, what Guénon would call the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, the period of decline. But eventually, that decline will be so profound that what will happen? We will begin to experience what happened at cycle C. So at C, we experience the ascent. Well, in B, we're going to be experiencing the ascent again. That means that if you look at this as a diameter, points C and B are analogous to each other. Here was earthly paradise. Here was creation of the garden. Point B is analogous because it's the fulfillment of the garden. It's the new Jerusalem. It's the conflagration. It's the new heavens and the new earth. And so Dante's saying, I'm at the midpoint of that. And it's exactly what he does in Inferno, because notice, what does he do? It's a journey to the center of the earth. And you go so far down in the earth. Look where my mouse is going. Dante starts here in Jerusalem. He goes so far down that he hits the center of the earth that when he starts climbing Satan's back, he's actually going so far down he goes upward. It's the paradox, because it's a wheel. In the Inferno, let me show this here. Dante, take a look at this. He goes so far down that he actually ends up moving upwards. And that gets him to Eden. And he continues ascending upwards towards absolute unity with God, the New Jerusalem, the beatific vision. You go so far down that you actually end up going up. That's in space. But Dante's saying if we visualize ourselves not just in space, but in time, I am at the midpoint. Because Jerusalem was believed to be the midpoint of the entire universe. Legitimately. That's why Dante believes the gate to hell is in Jerusalem. Well, so be it. The same is true here. I'm at the midpoint spatially by positioning myself at Jerusalem. But I am at the midpoint temporally because why? I'm at the middle of this cycle. 65 centuries from here to here is a rise. Another 65 centuries after me will be the decline. But that decline will become so profound that the cycle will reset itself, and we will again experience what it was like to be at point C, but here at point B. And this is what Guénon is saying, is that at any point of the circle, like let's say you and I are right here. We probably would be, right? If you and I are right here, we can position the circle such that we're at an exact midpoint. You're always at a midpoint between two parts of the circle, because this is what a circle does, is that the semicircle is a rise and descent, but that rise and descent eventually becomes a descent so profound that it becomes a rise, and a rise that is so profound that it eventually becomes a descent. And this repeats eternally. Now, this is what Guénon says. Is this a Nietzschean eternal recurrence of the same? No. It's analogous. So if Dante is right here at point A, Dante is saying, in another great cycle, in another 13,000 years, we will be here, let's say at this hypothetical point D, at the bottom of the circle. But that point is analogous to the point that I'm at now, because history rhymes. It will be something that is not the exact same as what is occurring to me now, but will be analogous, will be a rhyme with what has happened in the past. And Dante is saying, you, the reader, at this exact moment, you listening to this lecture, you're at a midpoint in history as well. Because why? History occurs in these great year cycles of 13,000 years. That every 13,000 years, it resets itself. We get to the other end of the circle, and the same thing occurs again. And then in another 13,000 years, the same thing happens again. Now, of course, this contradicts, at least exoterically, with the Christian vision of history as being linear, where it's like you have the creation of the world, you have the death and resurrection of Christ, and then you have Christ's return. And then history ends and you're outside of space and time. So in that sense, there is a contradiction. But Dante is saying, esoterically, these cycles continue. Because what happens in B? When Christ returns, and we get the new heavens and the new earth, we get the return of the new heavenly Jerusalem. Paradise is regained, to use Milton's word. We have Eden here at point C, and there will be Eden here at point B. And history will continue. Well, what will happen in this new Eden? The same thing that happened here. Exactly the same? No, it's not Nietzschean eternal recurrence of the same. But analogously, the cycle will continue. The wheel will keep spinning. I find that so extraordinarily beautiful. Good. Okay, let's continue forward. So he's saying this is not the Nietzschean eternal recurrent. What is he going to say? This can be represented geometrically in the following way. If the cycle in question is the half period of the precession of the equinoxes, and if the entire cycle is represented by a circumference, it will suffice to trace a horizontal diameter to divide the circumference into two halves, as we did, each of which will represent a half period, whose beginning and end correspond to the two extremities of the diameter. What would that be? That would be point C and point B. If we only consider the upper half circumference and trace the vertical radius, it will end at the median point corresponding to the midpoint of the times. The figure thus obtained is the sine, doesn't show up here, but the sine is effectively this semicircle with a line through it. That's the sign of the mineral. Is the sign mineral, that is to say the alchemical symbol of the mineral kingdom, surmounted by a cross, it becomes the globe of the world, the hieroglyph of the earth and the emblem of imperial power, which does show up in the Paradiso, an orb bisected by a cross. Vertical plane, the plane of space, horizontal, the plane of time. The orb representative of the cycle, of the universe, of the world. So you see, Dante is at the midpoint of space and time. That's what he's telling you. I am at the exact midpoint of the entire created order, of all of space and all of time. It's profound to those who can understand it, and you may have to take some time with it. It's truly mind-blowing. The latter use of the symbol in question leads one to think that it must have had for Dante a particular value, and the addition of the cross is implied in the fact that the central point at which he placed himself corresponded geographically to Jerusalem, where essentially the Divine Comedy begins, which represented for him what we can call the spiritual pole. Moreover, at the antipodes of Jerusalem, that is to say at the other pole, we have the mountain of purgatory. Literally, right? Because if you look at the map, you start here in Jerusalem, you descend into hell, you're at the center, you go so far down, you go up, right? Go back to the circle. You go so far in the circle that when you start going down, you start going up in time. In space, the same thing. You go so far down that you go up. And so you start here at Jerusalem, you go to the center of the earth where Satan is, and then you start going upward towards purgatory. And at the top of purgatory is Eden. So it rhymes. The earthly Jerusalem rhymes with the heavenly Jerusalem. You see the rhyme, just as we mentioned earlier, points C, Eden, point B, the heavenly Jerusalem, those 2 points in time rhyme. It's undoubtedly profound. Good. What does this represent? Which represent for him what we can call the spiritual pole. Moreover, the antipodes of Jerusalem, that is to say at the other pole, rises the mountain of purgatory, over which shine the 4 stars that form the constellation of the Southern Cross. This is the entrance to the heavens, because Dante begins his ascent in the Paradiso in Eden, whereas the entrance to hell is to be found under Jerusalem. And we find this depicted in the opposition, the antithesis of Christ suffering and Christ triumphant. Guénon continues, let us point out first that if one selects any starting point in time, this is to say any point on a circle, because time proceeds in these cycles, and then counts the length of the cyclical period from there, a point is always reached that is in perfect correspondence to that from which one started. For it is this very correspondence between the elements of successive cycles that ensures their continuity. One can therefore choose the origin so as to position oneself ideally at the midpoint of such a period. This yields two equal periods, the great years, the 13,000 year cycles, or 65 multiplied by 2, 65 centuries before, 65 centuries after. Two equal periods, the one anterior and the other posterior, and whose totality the full revolution of the heavens actually takes place, since all things finally find themselves in a position not identical, but analogically corresponding to the one that they have in the beginning. This can be represented geometrically in the following way. We've already done this. We don't need to do this again. T.S. Eliot, phenomenal quote from T.S. Eliot that I think expresses this. He says in Four Quartets, this is an East Coker, "In my beginning is my end." That there is a rhyme in space and time, that the beginning point of things is also where they end, because that's how the diameter of a circle works. When the diameter bisects, it gives a different point from which we see a rhyme. And the end of this cycle, the end of this 1300-year cycle, becomes the beginning of the next cycle, such that point B becomes point C. What point C is for Dante here, point B will become to another Dante at another point analogical to the point from which he's expressing it. Midway upon life's journey here, 65th century before the creation. Well, in the new creation, there will be another Dante at this particular point who will be at the midway point between these two cycles. Everything that happens once happens again. In my beginning is my end. Each beginning becomes an end. Each end becomes a beginning. Extraordinarily poetic. And Eliot understood this too. Eliot, most people don't know this, Eliot was something of a perennialist as well. And we have a lot to thank T.S. Eliot for. Another fun thing that most people don't know about T.S. Eliot, my personal favorite poet, in addition to being a traditionalist, in addition to being a profound sort of mystic spiritual authority in Christianity and having a wonderful critique of modernity, T.S. Eliot also is the reason we have the Philokalia in English. Faber and Faber, under T.S. Eliot, published the first edition of the Philokalia in English, which is quite extraordinary if you know anything about that. Now, we're going to get to the big conclusion. What is the payoff of all this? Why is Guénon talking about all these different cycles? From a properly initiatic point of view, what we have just said answers again to a profound truth, that being must above all, identify the center of his own individuality, represented by the heart in traditional symbolism, with the cosmic center of the state of existence to which this individuality belongs, in which he takes as a foundation from which to raise himself to the higher states. So think about this. What is the center of the human person or the human body? It's the heart. Go back to the cycle. Where is Dante? He's at the heart. He's at the center point. Literally at the center point of the universe in the Inferno. But also, he's midway between the creation of the world and the conflagration, the end of the world. He's midway between the cycle in this year 1300. But that midpoint also corresponds to the human heart. That midpoint also corresponds to the human heart. So the center in space is Jerusalem. The center, or rather, from Jerusalem to the center of the world. The center in time is the year 1300, the midpoint between the beginning and end of this cycle. But the center inside of Dante is the human soul, is the essence of the person itself. Why is that the center? Because at once it's the most chaotic point because of the individual expression of individuality, the expression of the eternal in a conditioned world of matter. It's essentially you're translating this thing that cannot be fully translated into matter. It becomes the central focal point, but also because from the soul, if the soul is more valuable than all the created order, all the possibilities of the created order exist within the soul. All that is created and ever could be created remains inferior to the human soul. And so for this reason, the soul is at the midpoint. The individuality, the heart of the human being is at the exact center point between space and time. All of the lower possibilities, all of the horizontal possibilities, and all of the superhuman possibilities are present within the essence of the human being, the heart. This is what Guénon is getting at, and this is what Guénon is saying Dante is trying to convey to us, this initiatic knowledge. It is in this center that perfect equilibrium resides, the image of the principal immutability of the manifested world. It is here that the axis connecting all the states project itself, the divine radius that, in its ascending direction, leads directly to the higher states to be attained. Any point possesses these possibilities virtually, and is, if one may put it so, a potential center. But it is necessary that it become so effectively through a real identification to render possible the total development of the being. This is why Dante, in order to raise himself to the heavens, has first of all to place himself at a point that is truly the center of the terrestrial world, both according to time and space. That is to say, in relations to the conditions that essentially characterize existence in this world. It's truly profound. And then, of course, we get his commentary on the end of the cycle. Well, what happens when we hit point B? Dante's at the midpoint, fair enough. What happens when we hit point B? But one will ask, what is the relationship between the 2 points in question and the extremities of the chronological cycle? So that we have the extremities in space. Where did I put that chart? The extremities in space, which of course Jerusalem here, heavenly Jerusalem here. Those are the extremities as expressed spatially. The extremities in time, the creation of the world, the conflagration, the return of Christ, the Eden, and the New Jerusalem. Well, okay, fair enough. But what is the relationship between the 2 points in question and the extremities of the chronological cycle? For one of them, the terrestrial paradise, this relationship is obvious. Indeed, it really corresponds to the beginning of the cycle. But for the other, it must be noted that the terrestrial Jerusalem is taken as the prefiguration of the celestial Jerusalem described in the Apocalypse. Symbolically, moreover, it is also in Jerusalem that one situates the place of the resurrection and judgment that end the cycle. The antibodal positions of these 2 points take on a new significance if we observe that the celestial Jerusalem represents the very constitution of the terrestrial paradise, according to an analogy applied in an inverse sense. So again, what's the inverse? Yes, we have Eden at the creation of the world, but the New Jerusalem is the reconquest of Eden. It is, as Milton will say, paradise regained. What was in the beginning is in the end. In my beginning is my end. That there is a rhyme in the diameter of the circle, both in terms of space, right, spatially, Jerusalem here, Eden here, but also in time, because when we look at this in time, creation here, New Jerusalem, conflagration, Christ returning here, and the cycle picks up again, because from point B, as we start going downward, it's what we experienced in point C, the ascent, just from a different vantage point. That's what it means that it's a cycle. All right, continuing forward. At the beginning of time, that is to say of the present cycle, the terrestrial paradise was rendered inaccessible following the fall of man. The New Jerusalem must descend from heaven to earth at the end of the same cycle to mark the reestablishment of all things in their primordial order. And one can say that it will play the same role for the future cycle that the previous terrestrial paradise does for the present one. The New Jerusalem will become what Eden is for us. So what Eden is for us, the New Jerusalem will become to the beginning of a new cycle. Because why? It does the same thing. The cycle keeps repeating. What was only virtual at the start of the cycle is realized effectively at its end, and immediately engenders the potentialities that will develop in their turn in the course of the future cycle. However, this is a matter on which we cannot dwell further without getting away completely from our subject, as if he hadn't done that, right? Now, returning back to Dante. Returning finally to what more directly concerns Dante's journey. It is relevant to note that if the crossing of the terrestrial world ends at the beginning point of the cycle, this alludes explicitly to the return to origins that hold so important a place in all traditional doctrines, and on which, rather remarkably, Islamic esotericism and Taoism in particular insist. It is a question again of the restoration of the Edenic state, of which we have already spoken, and which must be regarded as a precondition for the conquest of the superior states of the being. Good. And let's get to these last comments here. What is the relation of the great year? The great year is related to this idea of the great work. This is what Guénon is going to say. The point equidistant between the 2 extremities about which we have just been speaking, that is to say the center of the earth, is, as we have already pointed out, the lowest point. And it also corresponds to the middle of the cosmic cycle, when this cycle is envisaged chronologically, or under the aspect of succession, that is time. We can in fact divide the whole into 2 phases, the one descending, proceeding the direction of ever more accentuated differentiation, the other ascending, returning to the principal state. These 2 phases, which the Hindu doctrine compares to respiration, systole, diastole. The heart beats, the heart contracts. Exitus goes out into the world, reditus returns. Right? The tide goes out, the tide goes in. Even meter, unaccented, accented. Everything is systole, diastole. And so he's saying effectively this corresponds to coagulation, right? Everything coming together, and dissolution, everything falling apart. These eternal cosmic cycles, beginning, end, is systole, diastole. All of human time. These eternal cycles of human time that happen every 26,000 years, not literally but metaphorically. The great years, the great cycles. It's nothing more than the heart beating and contracting. Beating and contracting. Or I breathe in, I breathe out. I breathe in, I breathe out. The tide goes out, the tide comes back. The tide goes out, the tide comes back. It's the same thing. Every layer of creation has analogical correspondences with higher levels of creation. What we experience in breathing, or the beating of the heart, is what happens in these cosmological cycles of 26,000 years. This is what Guénon is trying to get at. We can, in fact, divide the whole into two phases. The one descending, proceeding in the direction of ever more accentuated differentiation. The other ascending, returning toward the principal state. These two phases, which the Hindu doctrine compares to respiration, are likewise found in the Hermetic doctrine, where they are called coagulation and solution by virtues of the law of analogy. And this is not that crazy. We see this in St. Thomas Aquinas. Many people don't know. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote a work of alchemy, which of course participates in the Hermetic tradition, where he says very similar things. And even the structure of the Summa Theologica itself is predicated on salve et coagula, coagulation, dissolution, respiration. I breathe in, I breathe out. It's exitus reditus. Exitus, God coming into the world. Because literally the first part of the Summa is all about God. Then we come to God entering into human existence and the particulars of human existence, and then through the sacraments in the church, human beings returning to God. That is the tripartite structure of the Summa. Exitus, coming out from God into the world. Reditus, beginning from the world, returning back to God. It's the same thing that you see in Hermeticism or in alchemy with salve et coagula. And it's a representation of, as Guénon is going to say, the great work. The great work reproduces in abbreviated form the whole cosmic cycle. Here we can see the representative predominance of the opposing tendencies of the tamas and the sattva, which we have already defined. The first is manifested in all forces of contraction and condensation. So the tamasic forces represent contraction, condensation, which is literally why at the center of the world you get Satan. It's all the tamasic forces coming together in a sort of gravity that binds everything together. Whereas the sattvic forces are represented by fire. They are expansive. They move outward. Notice, what does Dante have at the center of the world? Is it fire? No. Dante believes the center of the world is cold because it's the contractive forces. Whereas heaven for Dante is fire. It's in the Empyrean. It's hot. And of course, Christianity believes the world will be renewed by fire. Guénon is going to comment on this. But this is just to say everything is these eternal cycles of contraction and expansion. Contracted forces represent the tamasic forces of the human being. The expansive forces are represented by the sattvic forces, or by fire. Continuing forward, the second in all expansion and dilation. In this regard, we have again a correspondence between the opposite properties of heat and cold. The first dilating bodies, while the second contracts them. And this is why the last circle of hell is frozen. Lucifer symbolizes the inverse attraction of nature, that is to say, the tendency towards individualization, with all the limitations inherent in it. His abode is therefore the point to which all gravitates, the point to which all gravities, or in other words, the center of attractive and compressive forces represented by gravity in the terrestrial world. And the latter, which attracts bodies downward, that is towards the center of the earth, is really a manifestation of the tamas. So again, we've given this doctrine, we've given this diagram to explain this. Now, interestingly enough, Guénon is going to note this is the opposite of course, what modern science believes. And for René Guénon, he effectively says, anytime modern science is contradicting the spiritual wisdom of any of the exoteric religious traditions, it's because modern science is incorrect. He sees this sort of the quantitative worldview, you can see this in his book, The Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times, the modernistic material worldview as being effectively the opposite of the esoteric worldview. And so Guénon is effectively going to say any religious tradition is going to reject this doctrine of the geological fire, because of course the idea is, in the modern scientific understanding, we have fire at the center of the earth. It's the hottest point, right? The earth has this molten hot core, and then as you go further out in the universe, it gets colder and colder and colder. The farther out you are in the universe, the colder it is. And what is going to happen in the universe eventually? You're going to have the heat death of the universe. Eventually the universe will run out of heat. The Big Bang was like this sort of explosion of heat. Will run out of heat and everything will freeze. Billions upon billions of years from now. But I was going to say, how interesting that's the literal opposite of what we see in every world religion. Because in every world religion, the tamasic tendencies condense. They coagulate at the center of the earth, which is the coldest point. And the outermost sphere, the Empyrean, is made out of fire. And what will happen at the end of the world? Not the heat death of the universe with everything freezing, but everything being renewed by fire. Everything being renewed by what fire represents, the sattvas, the sattvic tendency. So he says here, we note in passing that this is contrary to the geological hypothesis of the central fire. for the lowest point must be exactly that where density and solidity are at their maximum. On the other hand, it is no less contrary to the hypothesis envisaged by some astronomers of an end of the world by freezing, seeing that such an end can only be a return to indifferentiation, everything just becoming matter, chaos, tamasic. Well, chaos is not at the end. Chaos is at the beginning, right? Because if you go back to what he said about the Vedas, we begin with the tamas, which Brahma then condenses into the rajas, rather expands into the rajas, being more specific, and then the rajas then become the sattvas. That process, cosmogonic process, is recapitulated in the human being, which starts as matter in the seed and the egg, becomes rajasic in the animal and vegetable forms, and then finally becomes sattvic in ensoulment, when it takes on a rational human soul. Modern science effectively says the opposite, that everything will return to a tamasic state of undifferentiation. Besides, the last hypothesis is in contradiction to all traditional conceptions. It was not only for Heraclitus and the Stoics that the destruction of the world must coincide with its conflagration. So interestingly enough, this is a point of correspondence between most religions and philosophies, that Heraclitus and the Stoics also believed that the world would end in conflagration. The same affirmation can be found almost everywhere, from the Puranas of India to the Book of the Apocalypse of St. John. And we must note again the agreement of these traditions with the Hermetic doctrine, for which fire, being that part of the elements which sattva predominates, is the agent of the renewal of nature or of the final restoration. And this is quite interesting. This is the last comment he's going to make before the 9th and final chapter of the work. He's going to say, the center of the earth therefore represents the extremament of manifestation in the state of existence under consideration. Why? It's the pivotal point. From the center, all change is possible. So if you go back here, from the center, one can remain or one can go upward. But it's from the center that all the other states, whether Rajasic, the purgatorial states in the Purgatorio, whether Sattvic, the paradisal states expressed in the Paradiso, or Tamasic, the states that are expressed in the Inferno, they are all accessible from the center. Similarly in time, because in the center point of time, any point in the cosmological or chronological cycle of the universe is accessible equidistant, because they're all equidistant from the center. All temporal and spatial points are accessible from the center. But remember, what is the center for Guénon? It's the human heart. The human heart is at the center of space and time. That is, if you had to summarize in one sentence, what is the esoteric doctrine that Dante puts in the Divine Comedy according to René Guénon? It's that the human heart is the center of existence. That within the individual human soul, all temporal and spatial possibilities are accessible. That the human can exhaust all of the superhuman, human, and infrahuman states if it binds itself to those states. Again, the idea, my Father's house has many mansions. What is the initiate going to do? He's going to examine each of the states, beginning with the tamasic states, rejecting them, moving upwards to the human states, acquiring virtue, love, and goodness, and then finally, mystically, through the desire of the superhuman states, accessing what is beyond man. This is possible only at the center point of time, of space, and of the human being, namely through the heart. That is why Dante says, we are midway upon life's journey. The poem opens with us at the center. Dante is at the center of his life. He's at the center of this cosmological cycle. He's at the center of the universe, outside of Jerusalem, and he begins with the center of us. His heart, his individual personality, and your heart, the reader's heart, your personality, your individuality. Good. The center of the earth therefore represents the extremament of manifestation in the state of existence under consideration. It is a true pivot point from which a change of direction occurs, the preponderance passing from the one to the other of the contrary tendencies. This is why an ascension or return toward the principle follows immediately upon a descent to the bottom of hell. And the passage from the one to the other hemisphere is accomplished by going around the body of Lucifer in a way that leads us to think that this central point is not without certain correspondence to the Masonic mysteries of the middle chamber, where it is also a question of death and resurrection. So again, in Masonry, there's this idea of the middle chamber, where essentially you're at a midpoint between death and resurrection, between the old you and the new you. Now, is he saying that Dante's a Mason? No, he's effectively saying that Dante, as part of his esoteric practice, these were ideas that were conveyed to him, most likely through the Knights Templar. And of course, Guénon believes the Masons obtained this idea of the middle chamber, the midpoint between death and resurrection, through the dissolved Knights Templar. Here again we find symbolic expressions of the two complementary phases that in initiation or in the Hermetic great work, which are essentially one and the same thing, express the same universally applicable cyclical laws upon which, for us, rests the whole construction of Dante's poem. What are those laws? The human soul at the center. That's it. That's what's being expressed. That is the great mystery. And so Guénon, in the final chapter, which is the shortest chapter, which is the most mystical chapter, concludes as follows, and I think this is such a wonderful conclusion. Under these circumstances, it will be readily understood that our claims are limited to providing only a point of departure for the reflection of those who, taking a genuine interest in these studies, meaning metaphysical studies, are able to grasp their true imports and to pointing out for them a way to research from which we believe a quite particular benefit could be derived. So he's saying, look, I'm like St. John the Forerunner. I'm St. John the Baptist. I am pointing out to you the way to initiation. I am pointing out to you the way to Sophia, to wisdom, to the integration of the lower, the human, and the higher states through Dante. Because he believes, again, what is the Divine Comedy? It's an initiatic text. It is a metaphysical text in the perennial tradition. This is how Guénon interprets it. And so I'm not here to explicate everything. I'm here to point out to you possibilities. I'm here to allude to possibilities. If this work has the effect of stimulating similar studies, this alone will be a far from negligible result. So much so because for us, it is not a question of more or less vain erudition, but of true comprehension. And without doubt, it is only through such means that it will be possible someday to make our contemporaries aware of the narrow-mindedness and insufficiency of their customary ideas. This is the insufficiency of the modern ideas. The supremacy of the traditional ideas expressed in both the exoteric and esoteric. The end we have in view is perhaps far distant, but even so, we can neither forget nor cease striving after it, while for our part shedding some light, however feeble it may be, on an aspect of Dante's work that is far too little known. Very good. Okay, we have gone on for over 3 hours. Hopefully this was edifying and interesting to you. Highly recommend. Read René Guénon. Read René Guénon. Read René Guénon again and again and again. Read the Divine Comedy, and in particular, read this wonderful short book, The Esoterism of Dante. As always, any comments, any questions, definitely leave those down in the chat. I am going to go take a little bit of a breather. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture. I hope you're all having a wonderful day, and I will see you all around. Take care.